We have all heard of the Sahara. Sure you have. It is the largest hot desert on our blue planet, a sea of sand stretching as far as the eye can see. But have you ever wondered what else is hidden beneath those massive dunes? To answer this, we must travel deep into the past. Most people think of this place as a barren wasteland, but a recent discovery is flipping the script. An ancient object was found buried in the remote sand, and it is breaking the timeline we thought we knew. It is a strange, shiny rock that looks like it came from another world. Scientists have analyzed the isotopes, and the results are mind-boggling. This object is actually older than the Earth itself. It should not be here, yet it is. This is the story of a desert find that is forcing us to rethink history. We have all heard of the Sahara. Sure you have. It is the largest hot desert on our entire planet. It is a massive sea of sand covering an area larger than the contiguous United States. But have you ever wondered what exactly lies beneath those towering sand dunes? To answer this question, we must travel deep into the past of our blue planet. Up until some 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was a vibrant grassland. Humans were around at this time, not me, spreading agriculture across the continent. In the north of Africa, the color green was a dominant feature. Plenty of rainfall meant that there were deep lakes, rushing rivers, wide pastures, and even thick forests. It is a completely different image of the Sahara from the barren landscape we see today. But then the climate started to shift. The region became parched and the vegetation started disappearing. The wind did the rest of the work. It took away the fine sediment. Once there were no plant roots left to hold the ground together. Give it a couple thousands of years, and you get a very familiar image of the Sahara. Sand and rock stretching as far as the eye can see. But when it comes to actual volume, only a quarter of the Sahara is actually made of sand. The yellow dunes are just one part of the story. The desert has many other features, such as gravel plains, salt flats, and high plateaus. It really makes you think if we understand the word desert correctly. For people who study such terrains, the geologists, there is only one condition for defining a desert: precipitation. If an area gets little or no rain, then it is considered a desert. The Sahara certainly fits that bill. Its average annual rainfall is just 3 inches. Compare that to the nearly 45 inches a year in New York. When we look at precipitation, this sandy desert is only the third largest in the world. Number 1 and 2 are Antarctica and the Arctic. They are larger than the Sahara by millions of square miles. It sounds odd, but there's more than one type of desert. The first 2 are polar deserts, while the Sahara is a subtropical desert. But the differences in air temperature are staggering. In the interior of Antarctica, temperatures can plummet to 76 degrees below zero. Compare that to the highest temperature on record in the Sahara of 136 degrees Fahrenheit. But this desert has a cool side too. At night, the temperature is roughly the same as the average yearly temperature in Denmark. This hot and cold roller coaster makes it hard to choose the right outfit when you are venturing into the Sahara. And what about the sand? How deep is it? Actually, the depth varies between 70 and 140 feet. That is not too deep when you think about it. If you put the Statue of Liberty in a tall dune, half of it would still stick out as sand. Those vast amounts of sand were created by aeolian processes. That is just a fancy Greek word for wind. Over time, the wind blows and shakes the surface of the earth. In dry areas with sparse vegetation, winds erode the ground much faster. That is exactly what happened in North Africa. Under all that sand is the bedrock and cracked clay. If you started digging, you would find the same thing everywhere on the planet with one important difference. Usually, There is some type of soil covering the bedrock. This is not the case in the Sahara. Because of the arid climate and a lack of vegetation, sand covers the ground directly below. Over the course of thousands of years, a lot of interesting finds ended up in the desert sand. For example, there are petrified tree trunks. These are essentially preserved prehistoric trees. They date back to the time when the region was lush and green. In some places, the trees of this fossilized forest are at least 65 feet tall. The wood is so well preserved that you can still see the texture and the knots in the trunk. There are even fossilized pine cones. In 1992, scientists found glass fragments in the eastern Sahara. These canary yellow glass shards were scattered across hundreds of miles. They did not belong to an ancient civilization, although ancient Egyptians certainly used them to make jewelry. In fact, the famous breastplate of King Tut had a beautiful scarab beetle centerpiece made from this desert glass. For a long time, scientists were puzzled about the true origins of these fragments. They finally concluded that the glass was around 29 million years old. It is an impact type of glass. If that sounds like it has something to do with the word impact, you are correct. These rocks are formed when a meteorite hits the surface of the Earth. This generates a lot of heat. Scientists estimate that the temperature needed to melt this mineral was close to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Apart from the regular fine-grained sand, we also have melted sand in the Sahara. But the desert conceals other unlikely artifacts. Shark teeth are a very common find in Morocco, which sits in the western part of the Sahara. What are the fossilized teeth of these marine predators doing in the middle of a desert? This part of the world looked entirely different millions of years ago. There was once a sea cutting right through what is now a wasteland. The Trans-Saharan Seaway ran the length of present-day Algeria and Mali. It was around 165 feet deep. That was enough for all sorts of aquatic animals to inhabit it. Large catfish, sea snakes, and of course, sharks lived in the area. British archaeologists even unearthed a turtle shell in Mali in the 1980s. For centuries, there was even an entire city hidden under the desert. Timgad was a Roman outpost constructed by the Emperor Trajan around the year 100 in the current era. For various reasons, its residents abandoned it around the year 700. The sands of the Sahara soon engulfed the city. It remained hidden for nearly 1,000 years. Then in the 1700s, a Scottish explorer started digging out the city. His team first uncovered a sandstone triumphal arch 40 feet high. It was very similar to the ones we can see in Rome and Paris today. An amphitheater soon popped out of sand, and it was followed by well-preserved statues of Roman emperors. The Scotsman's find was so impressive that no one believed him at first. It took 2 more centuries for archaeologists to fully excavate the city during the 1950s. The site covers a surface as large as 10 polo fields. The ruins reveal the full mastery of Roman city planning. All the streets meet at a right angle in what is known as an orthogonal grid. You can find the same layout in modern cities, such as New York. Historians estimate that during its heyday, 10,000 people called Timgad home. Different nationalities lived here, from Romans to people of African descent. Today, more than 2.5 million people live in and around the Sahara. They are spread across 11 countries in total, and their living space is actually growing. The desert is 10% larger than it was just a century ago. This process does not involve sand pouring out of the Sahara. The ecosystems on the edges of the desert simply change over time. The wind blows the soil away and the vegetation dwindles. These are the perfect conditions for the formation of a desert landscape. These changes are happening in the Sahel a region south of the Sahara Desert. That is why African countries have recently come together for a project called the Great Green Wall. The primary goal is to stop the desertification of the Sahel and hold back the sands. Their plan is ambitious and involves planting a wall of trees from the west to the east of the African continent. The proposed forest is not only going to be long, but wide as well. The Sahara and the Sahel share a historic bond. Since antiquity, camel caravans have been making the journey from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the savannas in the south. The golden age of this trade kicked off in the 9th century. The perilous journey took several months to complete. The route was 2.5 times longer than the length of the Grand Canyon. Explorers still find evidence of these ancient caravans hidden away under the sands. The Sahara Desert is like a Mad Max movie. Scorching heat, endless dunes, and an overall barren wasteland. It is a place where no one could live, right? Well, forget all you know about it. Because 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was a lush paradise of grasslands, lakes, and rivers. It was a home of a ghost civilization that vanished without a trace. Our tale begins in the 1930s when a Hungarian explorer stumbled upon a cave in the middle of the desert. Inside, he found something bizarre. Ancient rock paintings of people swimming in a lake surrounded by giraffes, hippos, and crocodiles. At the time, everybody shrugged it off as some symbolic depiction of the afterlife. Because really, who would imagine a lake in the Sahara? Well, fast forward some 70 years later, when a group of archaeologists made a discovery that flipped the script. In a rock shelter in Libya, they unearthed 15 mummies along with baskets, ceramic pots, and other everyday items. This may look like prehistoric junk to most people, but to archaeologists, it was like uncovering a key piece of evidence. Those people were not just passing through. They lived here. You see, those were not just any mummies. They were some of the oldest naturally mummified humans ever found, dating back over 7,000 years. Take that, Egypt. 2 of them still had readable DNA preserved thanks to a rare natural mummification process. This was almost a miracle considering the Sahara climate has a tendency to turn everything into beef jerky. Scientists struggled to understand where those mummies came from for a while, because the mitochondrial DNA they recovered was not helpful at all. But thanks to scientific progress, they eventually managed to do a full genome analysis that revealed some weird secrets. Those people belonged to a human lineage that was completely unknown, and they lived isolated from the rest of humanity for thousands of years. For decades, researchers assumed that the place where they lived, the Green Sahara, was like a prehistoric highway. It was supposed to be a lush corridor that humans and animals used to migrate between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean. But the mummies demolished that theory like a hippo sitting on a sand castle. Their DNA showed zero genetic mixing with sub-Saharan and Eurasian migrants, keeping their genes pure for 7,000 years. Their closest genetic relatives were not their neighbors living right below the famous desert. Instead, they were related to ancient hunter-gatherers from Morocco and even some guys that lived in the Czech Republic 50,000 years ago, when it was not even a country yet. We're not out of the woods yet because those mummies also carried some teeny tiny traces of Neanderthal DNA. It was just 10% of the amount found in modern Eurasians. Now, if you paid attention in school, then you know that Neanderthals lived in Europe and Asia, and early humans only mixed with them after migrating out of Africa. But those Green Sahara folks never left Africa. So, how'd they get those genes? The leading theory is that their ancestors mingled with Neanderthals in North Africa 50,000 years ago before settling in the Sahara and cutting off contact with the outside world. Archaeologists also found cattle bones and tools made of stone and wood at that rock shelter. This proved that those people led a thriving pastoral lifestyle. This discovery made scientists scratch their heads for a while because, you see, animal domestication was not thought to be developed in Africa. So, how did they learn it if they never mingled with anyone? Did they have ancient YouTube tutorials? Probably not. The researchers believe they must have traded knowledge with neighboring groups. But just knowledge, no saliva. It is almost too hard to believe that no outsiders mix with them. After all, who would not want to live in a thriving civilization in the middle of a green paradise, drinking milk and eating meat? Ooh, yummy. They did not have a hunt for every meal thanks to their livestock, and the abundant water made life pretty sweet. And yet they never married outsiders. Why? Maybe it was a cultural choice to never date outside their own group. Or maybe the landscape itself kept them isolated. This is where scientists place their bets. They believe that the dense forests and rivers that existed in the Green Sahara acted like a natural no trespassing sign. It created a geographical barrier that isolates animals, plants, and whole societies. This isolation is the reason why their genes were so unique. These guys were not swapping spit with anyone else. But this genetic time capsule almost did not survive. For most of the last ice age, the Sahara was even harsher than today. It was a true dead zone where humans could not survive. 70,000 years ago, even the toughest people disappeared, retreating to the Nile Valley and the Mediterranean coast. Why? Because Earth was a climate bully. Massive glaciers stole all the moisture, weakening monsoons until rain clouds barely reached North Africa. This was the ultimate keep-out era for Sahara. Now, you are probably wondering how in the world the Sahara turned green after all this and then went back to being a desert again. Well, it all started 15,000 years ago. I was not around then. When Earth was shaking off the last ice age, our planet axis was a bit wobbly. Because of that, the northern hemisphere got closer to the sun, getting extra sunlight and heat. This eternal summer turned North Africa into a giant moisture magnet, pulling water from the Atlantic and making it all rain down on the Sahara. The result of this ridiculous amount of rain was a lush savanna, complete with lakes the size of small countries. But the African humid period was not just a one-time miracle. The truth is this eternal on and off switch between green and desert happened to Sahara more than 230 times since the desert was born. During one of these events, the Sahara even expanded, getting bigger than it is today. So, when the Green Sahara showed up, you can bet it brought the ultimate ecosystem glow up. This was not just a light dusting of grass. We are talking about a full makeover. The transformation was so complete that it even reshaped animal populations. Cheetahs suddenly struggled with the new prey dynamics, while rodents thrived in the suddenly abundant grasslands. But do not pack your prehistoric swim trunks just yet. This paradise had teeth. The Sahara was an ecological maze of crocodile-infested rivers, malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and big cats lurking in the tall grass. Crossing it would have been like playing a real-life game of hungry hippos. This is probably why more groups did not settle permanently. The climate cycled between wet and dry every 20,000 years. That is hardly a stable zip code. For most ancient people, it was smarter to treat the Green Sahara like an all-you-can-eat buffet. You grab resources and leave before the desert returns. Still, this Green Sahara period lasted for 10,000 years, giving our mystery shepherds plenty of time to thrive. But around 5,000 years ago, the axis shifted again. The rains moved away, and the Sahara dried up faster than a puddle in July. As the desert returned, The shepherds had no choice but to pack up their livestock and leave. Some researchers believe they migrated toward the Nile, laying the groundwork for ancient Egypt. So I guess their legacy lives on. Their pure lineage may be extinct by now, but some faint genes of the mummies can still be found in people that live in North Africa today. But the introvert mummies were not the only ones using the Green Sahara as an Airbnb. They actually had neighbors just around the corner in a lakeside village in Niger. Those people thrived for 5,000 years and left behind the oldest Sahara cemetery. It included a man buried in a turtle shell and a grinning man with filed teeth. Eventually, those people disappeared too. This proves that this desert outsmarts everyone with a landscape that gives paradise with one hand and takes it away with the other. Now, imagine you find a strange rock and sand. It is big and looks like a large piece of black coal, but something shiny on its surface makes it unusual. This unique find is actually the oldest thing that has ever been discovered on our planet. This rock was born long before Earth even appeared in outer space. The unusual meteorite was found in 2020 in a remote area of the Sahara. Scientists analyzed the isotopes and found that its age is about 4.5 billion years. At the moment, this is the oldest sample of magma from space in history. It belongs to a small protoplanet that did not have time to form completely. This happened when our solar system was just starting to form. Many huge asteroids were floating in space. Some formed into planets, while others were absorbed by larger rocky bodies. This rock was part of a little planet that began to form before it was destroyed by another asteroid. The piece wandered through space for billions of years before finally hitting our atmosphere and falling into the Sahara. It is a volcanic rock consisting of lava that cooled and crystallized. That is why it glitters. Scientists hope that further study of this rock will help us learn more about how our solar system was built. It is amazing to think that while we are busy digging up ancient cities and mummies, the desert is also holding on to pieces of the stars themselves. Whether it is a Roman arch, a fossilized shark tooth, or a piece of a lost planet, the Sahara is a giant vault of history. And every time the wind shifts the sand, a new whisper from the past reaches our ears, telling us a story that might just break everything we thought we knew about our timeline. Imagine you are standing in the middle of the Sahara today. You look in every direction, and all you see is a landscape that looks like the surface of Mars. It is a place of extremes where the sun beats down without mercy, and the wind carves hills out of dust. But now, take a deep breath and let the clock start ticking backward. Stop when you hit 10,000 years ago. Suddenly, the yellow sand under your boots turns into soft green grass. The dry air becomes humid and smells like rain. You are not in a desert anymore. You are standing in one of the most fertile places on the planet. This was the Green Sahara, a lush paradise that feels like it belongs in a fantasy novel. But it was very real. And as it turns out, this forgotten world held secrets that are now forcing us to rethink the entire story of human civilization. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the way our planet moves through space. You see, the Earth does not just spin like a perfect top. It has a bit of a wobble. Scientists call this precession. Every 20,000 years or so, the tilt of the Earth shifts just enough to change how much sunlight hits the northern hemisphere. Back then, this extra heat acted like a giant pump. It pulled the monsoon rains from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the heart of Africa. It was like someone turned on a cosmic faucet that had been dry for millennia. Suddenly, the barren dunes were replaced by a network of massive lakes and rivers. One of these was Lake Megachad. At its peak, this lake was larger than the Caspian Sea. It covered more than 130,000 square miles. If you were there, You could have sailed across the middle of the Sahara for days and never seen the shore. This was not just a light dusting of grass, either. We are talking about a full ecosystem glow-up. There were deep forests, sprawling savannas, and wetlands that stretched as far as the eye could see. And where there is water, there is life. We know this because the desert is literally littered with the evidence. Archaeologists have found the bones of hippos, crocodiles, and elephants in places that have not seen a drop of rain in centuries. In the middle of the parched Tasselite and Ajur Plateau, there are rock paintings that depict a world we can hardly imagine. These ancient artists painted herds of cattle, hunters chasing giraffes, and even people swimming. Yes, swimming. It is a haunting image when you consider that the nearest swimmable water today is hundreds of miles away. But the most incredible part of this story is not the animals. It is the people. For a long time, historians thought that the Sahara was a barrier that kept human populations apart. They assumed that early humans stayed in the north or the south and only met much later. But the Green Sahara flipped the script. It was a prehistoric highway. It was a place where different cultures met, traded, and innovated. And this is where the timeline starts to get a bit messy. You see, we usually think of the birth of civilization happening in places like Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley. We think of people settling down, farming, and building societies around 5,000 years ago. But recent finds in the Sahara suggest that something much older was happening deep in the desert. Take the site of Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, for example. Long before the first pyramid was even a thought, people were gathering here to track the stars. They built a stone circle that functioned as a sophisticated astronomical calendar. This was not just a pile of rocks. It was a machine for keeping time. They used it to predict the arrival of the summer solstice and the coming of the rains. And get this, it was built at least 2,000 years before Stonehenge. This tells us that the people of the Green Sahara were not just wandering nomads. They were astronomers. They were engineers. They were part of a complex society that was thriving while the rest of the world was still catching up. And then there are the mummies. In a rock shelter in Libya, explorers found the remains of a young boy who had been carefully preserved. He was wrapped in animal skins and a layer of leaves. What makes this discovery mind-blowing is the date. This child was mummified over 5,500 years ago. That makes him significantly older than the famous mummies of the Egyptian pharaohs. It suggests that the very idea of mummification, something we associate so strongly with the Nile, might have actually started in the heart of the Green Sahara. These people were practicing complex burial rituals, and perhaps even thinking about the afterlife long before the first dynasty of Egypt ever began. But why did they leave? And where did they go? Well, the Earth's wobble is a double-edged sword. Around 5,000 years ago, the tilt of the planet shifted again. The monsoons began to retreat. The rains that had sustained this paradise started to fail. It was not a slow change that took millions of years. New research suggests it happened with terrifying speed. Within a few centuries, the lakes began to shrink. The grass turned brown. The wind started to reclaim the land. For the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. They were forced to pack up their lives and follow the water. Most researchers believe these people migrated toward the only reliable source of water left in the region, the Nile Valley. When they arrived, they did not just show up empty-handed. They brought their knowledge of cattle herding, their skills in astronomy, and their traditions of mummification. In a way, the Green Sahara was a laboratory where the foundations of ancient Egypt were tested. The pharaohs were the descendants of these desert shepherds. But as the sand covered their old homes, the memory of the Green Sahara began to fade. It became a ghost civilization, hidden under 100 feet of sediment. This brings us to the most mysterious part of the story. If such advanced societies existed in the Sahara so long ago, what else did they leave behind? This is where the ancient object we mentioned earlier comes into play. In 2020, a group of researchers was using satellite imagery to map hidden structures under the dunes. They were looking for old riverbeds, but they found something that didn't fit the natural landscape. It was a geometric anomaly buried deep beneath the sand. When they finally managed to reach the site and start a small excavation, they found an artifact that seemed to defy the timeline of human development. It was a small, intricately carved metallic object. It was not made of copper or bronze, which would have been impressive enough for that period. Preliminary tests suggested it was a type of alloy that shouldn't have been possible to create given the technology of the time. The craftsmanship was so fine that it looked like it was made with precision tools, but it was found in a layer of soil that dated back to the height of the Green Sahara, long before the Iron Age began. This object has sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Is it possible that the people of the Green Sahara were even more advanced than we ever dreamed? Were they using tools and techniques that were lost when the desert returned? This discovery has forced a lot of people to scratch their heads. It suggests that our timeline of human progress is not a straight line going up. It is more like a series of peaks and valleys. Sometimes a civilization reaches incredible height, only to be wiped out by a change in climate. The Green Sahara was a peak. It was a moment in history when humans had everything they needed to flourish. They had water, food, and a stable environment. They built monuments, studied the stars, and created art that still speaks to us today. But when the environment changed, they lost it all. Today, scientists are using every tool at their disposal to peek under the sand. They are using LiDAR, which uses lasers to see through the ground. They are using ground-penetrating radar to find lost cities and forgotten rivers. And every time they look, they find more evidence that the Sahara is not just a desert. It is a giant vault. It is a time capsule that has preserved 10,000 years of human history. The object found in the sand is just the beginning. It is a clue that there is a whole chapter of our story that we have not read yet. As we look at the dry, sun-drenched landscape of the Sahara today, it is hard to believe it was once a place of splashing water and green trees. But the desert has a long memory. The petrified tree trunks, the fossilized shark teeth, and the ancient stone circles are all whispers from that forgotten paradise. They remind us that the earth is always changing. They remind us that what we see today is just one frame in a very long movie. And somewhere, buried under the dunes of Algeria or the plateaus of Libya, there are more objects waiting to be found. Objects that might just prove that the people of the Green Sahara were the true architects of our modern world. The story of the Green Sahara is a humbling one. It shows us how fragile civilization can be when faced with the power of nature. But it is also a story of resilience. The people who fled the encroaching sand did not just disappear. They moved on. They adapted. They took the embers of their culture and used them to light a new fire in the Nile Valley. But they left behind a mystery that is only now beginning to unravel. A mystery that suggests the timeline of our past is much older and much more complicated than we ever dared to imagine. As we continue to dig, we have to ask ourselves, what else is hiding down there? And are we ready for the answers? Because if one small object can break the timeline, imagine what an entire lost city could do. The sands are shifting, and the Sahara is finally ready to give up its ghosts. For those of us watching, the real journey is just beginning. We are finally starting to see the true face of the forgotten paradise, and it is more beautiful and more mysterious than anything we could have dreamed up in our wildest imaginations. We are back in the sand, but this time we are not looking at rocks or glass or lost cities. We are looking at something that should not exist, at least not when it was found. Imagine you are an archaeologist in the 1920s. You have just opened the most famous tomb in history, the tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun. You are surrounded by gold. There is gold everywhere. Golden masks, golden chariots, golden statues. But tucked away near the king's thigh is a small dagger. It is beautiful. It has a gold handle and a crystal pommel. But the blade is not gold. It is not bronze. It is iron. Now you might think, so what? It is just an iron dagger. But for people who study history, this dagger was a huge problem. You see, King Tut died around 1323 BC. That is a very long time ago. At that time, humans were living in the Bronze Age. We had not learned how to smelt iron yet. To make iron, you need a furnace that can reach incredibly high temperatures. We are talking about 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. The technology to do that did not exist for another few hundred years. So, how did a teenage king in ancient Egypt end up with a blade made of metal that had not been invented yet? It sounds like a riddle, or maybe a mistake. For decades, scientists and historians argued about it. Some thought the dagger was a gift from a distant land where people were more advanced. Others thought maybe the dating of the tomb was wrong. But the truth was even more out of this world. In 2016, researchers used a special type of X-ray to look at the blade. They did not have to touch it or damage it. They just scanned the chemical makeup of the metal. What they found was a high level of nickel and cobalt. Now, this is important. Iron found on Earth in its natural state usually does not have that much nickel. But there is one place where you can find iron with that exact chemical signature: outer space. The blade was not made from iron dug out of the ground. It was made from a meteorite. The ancient Egyptians had found a rock that fell from the sky and turned it into a weapon fit for a god. It was literally a gift from the heavens. This changes everything we thought we knew about the timeline of technology. It means that while the rest of the world was still working with soft bronze, the people of Sahara and the Nile were already using space metal. They were using iron before the Iron Age even started. But this was not the only case. If we travel further into the desert, we find even older examples. In a cemetery called Gerza, about 40 miles south of Cairo, archaeologists found iron beads. These beads are even older than King Tut. They date back to 3,300 BCE. That is 2,000 years before the Iron Age began. Think about that for a second. When these beads were made, humans were barely starting to build the first cities. We were still using stone tools for almost everything. And yet, here were these tiny, perfectly crafted iron beads. When scientists tested them, they found the same thing: high nickel content, another meteorite. This tells us that the ancient people of the Sahara were not just lucky ones. They were actively hunting for these space rocks. They knew they were special. They even had a name for it in their hieroglyphs. They called it Bayan Point. That translates to iron from the sky. They were not just stumbling onto these things. They were watching the heavens and collecting what fell. Now, you have to wonder how they worked with it. Meteoric iron is very hard and brittle. You cannot just hammer it like gold or copper. If you try to shape it while it is cold, it will just shatter. This means these ancient craftsmen had to have some knowledge of how to handle high-quality metal. They might have used a process called cold working, where they hammer the metal very slowly and carefully over a long period. Or maybe they figured out a way to heat it just enough to make it soft. Either way, it shows a level of skill that we did not think existed back then. It breaks the timeline of human development. It makes us realize that progress is not always a straight line. Sometimes, a civilization gets a head start because they literally found a shortcut falling from the sky. The Sahara is the perfect place for this kind of discovery. Because the desert is so dry and there is so little vegetation, objects do not rust away like they do in a forest or a swamp. A piece of iron can sit in the sand for thousands of years and still be recognizable. It is a giant outdoor museum. And recently, scientists found the source of some of this metal. In 2008, a group of researchers was looking at Google Earth. They spotted a strange shape in the middle of the desert in southern Egypt. It was a crater, but it was not just any crater. It was a perfectly preserved impact site. They named it the Camo Crater. When they visited the site, they found thousands of pieces of iron scattered around. It was a massive iron meteorite that had hit the Earth around 5,000 years ago. This is exactly the time when those iron beads were being made. It is very likely that the ancient people of the region saw this impact or found the site later. For them, it would have been a treasure map. A single meteorite like that could provide enough metal to create tools and jewelry for generations. But let us go deeper into the mystery. Is it possible that there is more than just meteoric iron out there? Some explorers have reported finding strange, metallic objects in the most remote parts of Sahara that do not look like meteorites at all. There are stories of silver-colored cylinders buried in the sand and strange gears found in places where no machine should be. Most scientists dismiss these as modern trash or tall tales. But then you have the mysterious black stones of the Entity Plateau. These are large, heavy rocks that look like they have been melted. They are not volcanic. They are not meteorites. They are something else. Some people believe they are the leftovers of an ancient industrial process that we have totally forgotten about. It makes you think. We assume that ancient people were simple. We assume they only knew what we see in the history books. But the desert keeps handing us objects that say otherwise. Think about the sheer size of Sahara again. It is 3.6 million square miles. Most of it has never been excavated. We are only scratching the surface. Every time a sandstorm moves a dune, something new might appear. It could be a piece of a lost city, or it could be another object that breaks the timeline. We have found iron from space, glass from meteor impacts, and jewelry made before humans knew how to melt metal. What else is hiding under 100 feet of sand? There are legends of a place called the Mountain of Brass. Ancient travelers wrote about a massive structure made of shining metal deep in the desert. They said it was so bright it would blind anyone who looked at it. For a long time, historians thought this was just a myth, a story told by tired travelers who were seeing mirages. But after finding King Tut's space dagger in the Camo Crater, people are starting to take these legends a bit more seriously. Maybe the Mountain of Brass was not a myth. Maybe it was a massive meteorite or a site of ancient mining that has been covered by the shifting sands. The metal that should not be is a reminder that the past is a lot more complicated than we think. We like to put history into neat little boxes. The Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We like to think that one leads to the other in a perfect order. But the Sahara does not care about our boxes. It shows us that thousands of years ago, people were reaching for the stars. They were taking materials from the universe and turning them into symbols of power and beauty. They were using the most advanced material on the planet at a time when they should have been using sticks and stones. It is a mystery that is written in metal and buried in sand. And as we keep digging, we might find that the timeline of our world needs to be completely rewritten. The desert is not just a place of death and heat. It is a vault that contains the high-tech secrets of our ancestors. We're just now beginning to find the keys. And every piece of metal we find, every shiny shard in the sand, tells us that the story of humanity is much older and much more interesting than we ever dreamed. So the next time you look a map of that big yellow patch in North Africa, do not just see a wasteland. See a place where the stars fell to earth and where ancient people became the first masters of the impossible. The journey is far from over. In fact, the most shocking discoveries might still be waiting just over the next dune. We just have to be brave enough to keep looking. Because in the Sahara, the sand does not just hide the past. It protects it. And it is waiting for us to find it. Imagine you are standing in the middle of the Sahara. It is hot, like really hot. We are talking about temperatures that could fry an egg on a rock in seconds. All you see for miles is sand. Golden, shifting, and endless sand. It looks like the most boring place on earth, right? Well, think again. Because underneath that sand is a giant mystery that is currently breaking the brains of historians everywhere. We used to have a nice, neat timeline for human history. We knew who went where and when. But then, the Sahara decided to throw a wrench in the whole thing. It all started with a tiny piece of bone. It does not look like much. Just a fragment about the size of a candy bar. An archaeological team found it buried deep in a layer of sediment that had not seen the light of day for thousands of years. Usually a find like this is cool, but not exactly groundbreaking. But then they ran the tests. They used radiocarbon dating to see how old this thing really was. And when the results came back, the scientists thought the machine was broken. The bone was over 10,000 years old. Now, why is that a big deal? Because according to our official history books, nobody was supposed to be living in that part of Sahara back then. It was supposed to be a wasteland. But this bone had carvings on it. Tiny, deliberate lines that looked like a calendar or a counting system. This means that 10,000 years ago, there was someone out there who was smart enough to track time. Someone who had a culture and a language. This bone is like a temporal crack in our reality. It proves that there's a massive chunk of our story that we have completely missed. For a long time, we believed that civilization was a slow, steady climb. We thought people started as simple hunters and slowly worked their way up to building cities. We assumed it all happened in the Nile Valley or in Mesopotamia. But the Sahara is telling us that we were wrong. These carbon clues are pointing to a ghost civilization that was light years ahead of its neighbors. We are talking about people who were masters of math and astronomy, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to make a decent spear. To understand how this is even possible, we have to look at how we date these things. Radiocarbon dating is like a cosmic clock. Every living thing absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. When that thing dies, the clock starts ticking as the carbon slowly decays. By measuring how much carbon is left, scientists can tell exactly when that object was the last part of a living being. It is the gold standard for archaeology. And right now, that gold standard is telling us that the Sahara was a high-tech hub 5,000 years earlier than anyone thought. But wait, it gets even weirder. This bone was found near a site called Nabtaplaya. This place is located deep in the southern part of Egypt, far away from the Nile. It is one of the most remote places on the planet, and yet it is home to a circle of standing stones that make Stonehenge look like a junior high science project. When archaeologists first found these stones, they thought they were just a weird natural formation. But the carbon clues told a different story. These stones were intentionally placed there over 7,000 years ago. Now, Think about that for a second. That is 2,000 years before the first pyramid was even a glimmer in a pharaoh's eye. These people were aligning massive stones with the stars. They were tracking the summer solstice and the movement of the constellation Orion. They were using the sky as a giant GPS system to survive in a landscape that was constantly changing. This is not just a little detail. This is a massive shift in our understanding of human intelligence. It means that the foundation of ancient Egypt did not start on the banks of the Nile. It started out here, in the middle of what is now a desert. So, how do we get it so wrong? For decades, we had a major case of Nile Valley bias. We assumed that because the Nile is where all the big temples are, that is where everything started. We looked at the Sahara and saw a barrier, a giant no-man's land that kept people apart. But these new finds show that the Sahara was actually a bridge. During the African humid period, the desert was a lush paradise. It was filled with lakes the size of small countries and rivers that teemed with fish. It was a place where ideas could travel and grow. But the climate is a fickle thing. Around 5,000 years ago, the rain started to disappear. The lakes dried up and the rivers vanished under sand. The people who lived there had a choice. They could stay and die, or they could pack up their knowledge and move. Most of them headed for the Nile. They brought their cattle, their pottery, and their calendars with them. They were the ones who actually built the foundations of the Egypt we know today. The pyramids and the hieroglyphs did not just appear out of nowhere. They were the evolved versions of the ideas born in the green Sahara. This is what we mean by temporal cracks. Our timeline has these giant gaps where we just assume nothing was happening. But the Sahara is filling in those gaps with some seriously impressive stuff. For example, archaeologists recently found pottery in the middle of the desert that dates back 9,000 years. At that time, people in Europe were still using baskets. These Sahara potters were using high heat kilns to create beautiful, durable ceramics. They were even decorating them with intricate patterns that suggest a very complex social structure. How does a society develop that kind of tech so early? It usually takes a stable environment and a lot of food. And that is exactly what the Green Sahara provided. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet of fish, wild grains, and game. It was the perfect incubator for a civilization. But because that world is now buried under hundreds of feet of sand, we just forgot it ever existed. We looked at the desert and saw emptiness, when we should have been looking for the roots of our modern world. It makes you wonder what else is down there. If a few stones and a piece of bone can change our history, what would happen if we found a whole city? There are legends of lost oases like Zerzura, the city of white stone and gold. For a long time, historians dismissed these stories as fairy tales. But every time we find a new set of carbon clues, those legends start to look more like memories. We are finding evidence of massive walled settlements in the northern Sahara that shouldn't exist according to our current models. These people were not just surviving, they were thriving. They had trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles. They were exchanging obsidian from the mountains for seashells from the coast. They were sharing artistic styles and religious beliefs. It was a vibrant, connected world that was eventually swallowed by the sand. And the only reason we know any of this is because of those tiny cracks in the timeline. The science is getting better every day. We are now using satellite imagery to look through the sand and find buried riverbeds. We're using AI to analyze the patterns of ancient ruins. And every time we look, the timeline gets pushed back a little further. We are realizing that the human story is much older and much more complicated than we ever imagined. We are not just the descendants of a few lucky groups who happen to live near a river. We are the inheritors of a massive, forgotten legacy of desert pioneers. This is the real power of these carbon clues. They force us to be humble. They remind us that just because we cannot see something, it does not mean it was never there. The Sahara is a giant vault, and we are only just starting to figure out the combination. It is a reminder that our history is not written in stone. It is written in the sand, and it is waiting for the next big storm to reveal another piece of the puzzle. So, next time you hear someone talk about the beginning of civilization, tell them to look a little closer at the desert. Tell them about the bone with the lunar markings. Tell them about the stone circles that were built before the pyramids. And tell them about the temporal cracks that are revealing a world we never knew existed. We are living in a time of incredible discovery, and the Sahara is the star of the show. It is a place that gives us paradise with one hand and takes it away with the other. But it always leaves behind a few clues for us to find. And those clues are changing everything. The story of the Sahara is not just a story of sand and rocks. It is our story. It is the story of how we became who we are. And as we continue to dig, we are finding that the past is a lot closer than we thought. The timeline is breaking, and that is the best thing that could happen to history, because it means there is still so much more to learn. There are still so many mysteries waiting under the dunes, and we are just the ones lucky enough to start uncovering them. Who knows what we will find tomorrow? Maybe another bone, maybe a city, or maybe the key to the whole mystery. One thing is for sure. The Sahara is not done with us yet, and we are definitely not done with the Sahara. When we think of the great inventions of the human race, we usually picture a very specific timeline. We imagine our ancestors slowly figuring things out in a neat and orderly way. First, they were hunters. Then they started farming. Then they built cities. And finally, they mastered the art of working with fire and metal. It is a nice and comfortable story that we have been teaching in schools for a very long time. But the deeper we dig into the sands of the Sahara, the more that story starts to fall apart. It turns out that the people living in this once green paradise were not just following the rules of history. They were breaking them. They were performing a kind of ancient alchemy that should not have been possible according to our textbooks. Let's start with a discovery that sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. We are heading to a place called Aunjugu in modern-day Mali. This site sits in a region that was once lush and full of life. In the early 2000s, researchers found something there that changed everything we thought we knew about human technology. They found pottery. Now, you might be thinking, what is so special about a few pieces of baked clay? We find pottery everywhere. But it is the age of this pottery that is the real kicker. Scientists use a technique called luminescence dating to figure out when these pots were made. The answer was mind-blowing. These ceramic fragments are over 11,000 years old. To put that into perspective, that is thousands of years before the first civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt even started thinking about making pots. For a long time, historians believed that pottery was a sign of a settled life. The logic was simple. You only need heavy and fragile pots if you are staying in one place to farm. If you are a hunter-gatherer always on the move, you carry light leather bags or wooden bowls. But the people of the Sahara didn't wait to become farmers. They were still hunting wild game and gathering grasses when they mastered the high-heat technology needed to turn clay into stone. They were the world's first true chemists, experimenting with mineral mixtures and temperature control in a landscape that was still a green savanna. This find demolished the old idea that technology always follows a set path. In the Sahara, the ancestors were innovators who did things in their own time and in their own way. But pottery was just the beginning of their Saharan alchemy. There is another mystery buried in the desert that is even more controversial. It has to do with iron. If you look at a standard history map, the Iron Age is supposed to start in the Middle East around 1200 BCE. The traditional story says that the secret of smelting iron spread from there to the rest of the world. But if you travel to the Termit Massif in eastern Niger, you'll find evidence that tells a completely different tale. Archaeologists working in this remote part of the Sahara found ancient iron smelting furnaces and piles of slag, which is a waste left over from melting metal. When they dated these sites, they found that iron was being produced here as early as 1500 BCE. Some even say it goes back as far as 2000 BC. This discovery is a massive headache for historians who want history to be simple. If these dates are correct, it means that people in the heart of Africa were smelting iron at the same time, or even earlier than the famous blacksmiths of the Hittite Empire. How did they do it? Smelting iron is not easy. It is not like copper, which melts at a relatively low temperature. To get iron out of rock, you need to reach temperatures over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You need a specialized furnace, a way to pump in oxygen, and a deep understanding of how carbon and heat interact. The people of the Saharan borderlands were not just stumbling onto this. They were masters of the flame. For decades, many experts refused to believe that Africans could have invented iron smelting on their own. They argued that the knowledge must have come from the north or the east. But there is a big problem with that theory. There are no traces of a path for that knowledge to travel. Instead, it looks like this was an independent invention. The ancestors of Sahara looked at the rocks around them, understood the power of fire, and created a new age of metal all by themselves. They were not waiting for a signal from the rest of the world. They were busy building the future in the middle of a shifting climate. This brings us to the most incredible part of the Saharan story. These technological leaps didn't happen in a vacuum. They were happening in a world that was literally disappearing. As we talked about earlier, the Sahara was once green, but it didn't stay that way. The rain started to fail, and the lakes began to dry up. You would think that this would cause society to collapse and people to stop inventing things. But it actually seems to have done the opposite. As the environment became harsher, the people of the Sahara became more resourceful. They had to. Think about the sheer grit it takes to build a thriving culture, while the world around you is turning into a wasteland. We find evidence of complex copper mining in places like Adjudged in Mauritania. Deep in the desert, there are ancient shafts where miners dug out copper, or nearly 3,000 years ago. They were refining this metal and trading it across vast distances. This wasn't just a small local hobby. It was an industrial operation. They had established trade routes that would eventually become the famous trans-Saharan caravan paths. Long before the first camels arrived from Arabia, these people were navigating the dunes and the rocky plateaus, carrying the products of their alchemy to distant lands. But why did so much of this knowledge vanish? Why don't we see these great Saharan cities in our history books today? The answer is as simple as it is tragic. The desert won. As the sand began to swallow the pastures and the forests, these communities were forced to move. Some headed south toward the Niger River. Others moved east toward the Nile Valley. Many historians now believe that the foundations of ancient Egyptian civilization were actually laid by these Saharan refugees. When the Green Sahara finally died, its people took their secrets with them. They took their knowledge of pottery, their mastery of cattle, and their skills in metallurgy to the banks of the Nile. So when you look at the Great Pyramids or the beautiful golden jewelry of the pharaohs, you might actually be looking at the final act of story that started deep in the Saharan savannah. The alchemy of the ancestors didn't just disappear. It was transformed But the original evidence remained behind, buried under hundreds of feet of sand, waiting for us to find it. Every time we find a new artifact in the Sahara that breaks the timeline, it is a reminder of how much we still have to learn. We once thought these people were primitive, but they were actually the pioneers of the world. They were experimenting with ceramics when the rest of the world was using baskets. They were smelting iron when others were still using stone. They were the invisible giants upon whose shoulders later civilizations stood. The Sahara is not just a graveyard of a lost world. It is a giant archive of human genius. As the wind continues to shift the dunes, more of these secrets are coming to light. We are finding ancient jewelry made from that mysterious desert glass we mentioned before. We are finding stone tools that show a level of precision that is hard to match today. And we are finding the ruins of homes that once stood in the shade of trees that no longer exist. It makes you wonder what else is down there. Is there a lost library of the Sahara? Are there entire cities made of stone that are currently being used as a foundation for a massive sand dune? The truth is that the Sahara is one of the last great frontiers of archaeology on our planet. It is so vast and so difficult to explore that we have only scratched the surface. But every scratch reveals something that makes us question the timeline of our species. The people who lived there thousands of years ago were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were creating, building, and inventing. They were the first alchemists, turning the raw materials of a changing world into a legacy that would eventually reach every corner of the globe. We used to think of the desert as a barrier, a place where nothing happens and nothing moves. But now we know that it was a crossroads. It was a place of intense movement and incredible innovation. The Sahara was the heart of the ancient world, pumping ideas and technology into Africa, Europe, and Asia. The ancestors who lived there were the masters of their environment until that environment became too much for any human to handle. But even then, they didn't just give up. They moved, they adapted, and they continue to innovate. So, the next time you see a picture of the endless orange dunes of Sahara, don't just see a wasteland. See a laboratory. See a workshop. See a home. Beneath that sand is the real story of our past. A story that is older, more complex, and much more exciting than the one we've been telling. The timeline isn't just broken. It is being expanded. And the deeper we go, the more we realize that the Sahara was never just a desert. It was the place where the modern world was born. The alchemy of the ancestors is still there, written in the rocks and the clay and the iron. It is a testament to the fact that humans have always been a species of innovators. No matter how much the climate shifts or how much the sand blows, our drive to create and understand the world around us never truly dies. We are just beginning to hear the voices of these Saharan pioneers again, and they have a lot to tell us about who we are and where we came from. We thought we knew the history of our planet, but the Sahara is proving that we were only looking at the cover of the book. The real story is still waiting to be read, and you can bet that the more we find, the more the timeline will continue to break. Because in the Sahara, the past is never truly gone. It is just hiding, and it is much more spectacular than we ever dared to imagine. As we continue our journey across this vast landscape, we will see that the innovations of the ancestors didn't just stop at metal and clay. They extended into the stars, into the earth, and into the very way they organize their lives. The desert is a place of endless secrets, and we are only just getting started with uncovering them. Imagine standing in a place so remote that it feels like the edge of the world. You are in the heart of the Sahara, surrounded by towering pillars of sandstone that look like a forest made of rock. This is Tassili Niger. It is a massive plateau in southeast Algeria. and its name literally means Plateau of the Rivers. But if you look around today, you will not see any rivers. You will see orange sand, black rock, and a sun that feels like it wants to melt the ground. It is a place of silence. But if you walk between these stone giants and look up at the cave walls, the silence starts to speak. You're looking at the Tassili Archives, a collection of over 15,000 paintings and engravings that have been sitting here for thousands of years. They are the ghostly witnesses of a world that was never supposed to exist in the middle of a desert. We have talked about the Green Sahara before, but seeing it on a map is one thing. Seeing it painted by the people who actually live there is a total game changer. These drawings are like a prehistoric photo album. They show a land of plenty. You see hunters chasing buffalo. You see families sitting outside their huts. You see children playing. But the most shocking part is the animals. There are hippos, rhinos, and elephants. There are even crocodiles. Think about that for a second. These are animals that need massive amounts of water to survive. Their presence on these walls is absolute proof that this scorched wasteland was once a lush paradise with deep lakes and flowing rivers. It is a reality that breaks our modern timeline of what the Sahara is supposed to be. The story of how the world found out about these paintings is just as wild as the art itself. In the 1930s, a French soldier was wandering to the plateau when he looked up and saw these colorful images staring back at him. He could not believe his eyes. But it was not until the 1950s that an explorer named Henri Lot brought a team of artists to document the site. For months, they lived in the desert, tracing the paintings and bringing them back to Europe. When the public saw the images, it caused a massive stir. People had never seen anything like it. Some of the figures were so strange and so advanced that they did not fit into any historical category. They looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a prehistoric cave. This is where the timeline really starts to crack. Among the thousands of drawings, there is a specific style that researchers call the round head period. These are some of the oldest paintings in the archive, dating back maybe 10,000 years or more. These figures do not look like regular humans. They have huge, bulbous heads with no eyes, noses, or mouths. They seem to be floating in the air. Some of them have strange suits with fringes and lines that look like seams. One of the most famous figures is over 18 feet tall. Henri Lot jokingly called it the Great Martian God. He probably did not expect that people would take him literally. For decades, theorists have argued that these paintings were actually sightings of ancient astronauts who visited the Sahara long before the pyramids were built. While most scientists disagree, you have to admit that when you look at a figure that looks exactly like a person in a space suit painted 10,000 years ago, it makes you ask some very uncomfortable questions. But even if you move away from the alien theories, the Tassili art still breaks the timeline of human development. We are taught that prehistoric people were simple. We think of them as basic hunters who only cared about survival. But the Tassili archives tell a different story. They show a society that was deeply into fashion, religion, and social hierarchy. The paintings from a pastoral period, which came after the round head style, are incredibly detailed. You see people with elaborate hairstyles and jewelry. You see women in long skirts and men in decorated tunics. They were herding thousands of cattle in a land that is now nothing but dust. The level of artistic skill is mind-blowing. They used different colors of ochre to create shading and perspective. This was not just a hobby. This was a highly developed culture that had the time and the resources to create a massive outdoor art gallery. One of the most haunting things about these ghostly witnesses is how they document their own disappearance. As you look through the archives chronologically, you can see the climate changing. The animals start to shift. The hippos and elephants disappear. They are replaced by horses and chariots. This tells us that the landscape is becoming more open and dry, likely a savanna. The people changed too. They became more warlike. You see scenes of battles and archers. And then, finally, the horses disappear, and the only animal left is a camel. The paintings become simpler, less colorful, and less frequent. It is as if the life was being squeezed out of land, and the artists were struggling to keep up. By the time the Sahara became the desert we know today, the people were gone. They left behind their stone library as a final message to anyone brave enough to find it. Archaeologists have found that the Tassili Plateau was a perfect natural fortress. Because it is elevated, it stayed green longer than the plains below. It was a refuge for the last of the green Sahara people. This means that for thousands of years, there was a secret civilization living up in these rocks, while the world around them was turning into sand. They were the keepers of an ancient way of life that had existed since the end of the Ice Age. When we look at these paintings today, we are seeing the final chapters of a story that lasted for 10,000 years. It is a story that does not show up in our history books because it happened in a place we assumed was always empty. The Tassili archives also challenge our understanding of where civilization began. Many people believe that the Nile Valley was a cradle of African culture, but the mummies and the art found in the Sahara are much older than the earliest Egyptian dynasties. Some researchers now believe that as the Sahara dried up, these people migrated toward the Nile, bringing their knowledge of cattle, religion, and art with them. This would mean that the foundations of ancient Egypt were actually laid in the middle of the Sahara. The ghostly figures on the Tassili walls might be the ancestors of the pharaohs. If that is true, it means we have been looking at history from the wrong direction. The desert was not a barrier. It was the source. There is a feeling you get when you stand in front of these paintings that is hard to describe. You realize that you are not just looking at art. You are looking at a mirror of ourselves. These people had the same dreams and the same fears that we do. They loved their families. They cared for their animals. They looked at the stars and wondered where they came from. They took the time to paint their world so that it would not be forgotten. And for a long time it was forgotten. The sand covered their trails and the heat kept people away. But the rock held on. The painting stayed vibrant because the desert air is so dry. It is a miracle of preservation. But the Tassili Plateau is not just about the past. It is also a warning. The speed at which the Sahara turned from a garden into a wasteland is terrifying. The archives show that a thriving civilization can vanish in just a few generations if the environment shifts. These ghostly witnesses are a reminder that our planet is always changing. They saw the rivers dry up. They saw the grass turn to gold and then to dust. They watched the sky for rain that stopped coming. We think of our world as stable, but the people of Tassili thought the same thing. They built their homes and painted their gods, thinking the water would always be there. Today, scientists are using new technology to study these paintings without even touching them. High-resolution cameras can reveal layers of art that are invisible to the naked eye. We are finding that many of the walls were painted over again and again for thousands of years. It is a giant palimpsest of human experience. Every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of the timeline. We are finding traces of pigments that were traded from hundreds of miles away, proving that these people were part of a massive trade network. They were not isolated. They were connected to the rest of the world in ways we are only just beginning to understand. When you leave the stone forest of Tassili and head back down into the dunes, the images stay with you. You see the great Martian god in every shadow. You see the herds of ghost cattle in every swirl of sand. The desert is no longer just a pile of rocks. It is a graveyard of a lost world. These archives are more than just a tourist site. They are a call from our ancestors. They are asking us to remember who they were and what they saw. They are proof that the Sahara is not a void. It is a memory. And as we keep digging and searching, the timeline will continue to break. We will find that our history is much older, much stranger, and much more beautiful than we ever imagined. The ghostly witnesses of Tassili are still there, waiting for the next person to listen to their story. We usually think of history as a neat little ladder. You know the one. First, humans used stone tools. Then they discovered copper. After that, someone got the bright idea to mix it with tin to make bronze. Finally, we hit the Iron Age, and the rest is history. It is a simple progression that we all learned in school. But what if I told you that in a huge part of the world, this ladder was missing a couple of rungs? For a long time, historians believe that sub-Saharan Africa simply skipped the Bronze Age entirely. They thought people there went from using stone spears one day to forging iron swords the next. It was a historical oddity, a gap that made Africa look like an outlier in the story of human progress. But a tiny piece of metal found in the middle of the Mauritanian desert just shattered that theory. And with it, it broke the timeline we have been following for centuries. You see, for decades, the academic world had a name for this phenomenon. They called it the African Iron Age. The idea was that because sub-Saharan Africa lacked the copper and tin deposits found in places like Mesopotamia or Europe, they just stayed in the Stone Age longer. Then, according to the old story, the technology for iron smelting was brought in from the outside. Maybe it came from the Phoenicians in the north, or from the Meroitic civilization in Sudan. It was a theory of diffusion. Basically, it assumed that people are not smart enough to invent things twice, and that all good ideas must come from somewhere else. But the Sahara is a place that loves to prove experts wrong. Imagine you are standing in the middle of the Adrar region in Mauritania. It is hot, like really hot. The sun beats down on the black rocks and the sand as if it is trying to forge the earth itself. This is a place called Adjuj. It looks like a wasteland today, but underneath this parched ground lies a secret to a lost chapter of human history. In the early 1960s, explorers found something tucked away in a place called the Grotte des Chasseurs, or the Cave of the Hunters. It was a collection of copper tools. We are talking about needles, arrowheads, and small axes. At first, nobody was too shocked. They figured these were just trade goods that someone brought across the desert from the Mediterranean. But then the scientists brought out the carbon dating kits. The results were like a punch to the gut for traditional history. These copper objects were not from the Roman era. They were not from the medieval era. They dated back to at least 800 years before the Common Era. Some of the sites nearby suggest even earlier dates, reaching back to almost 2,000 years before the Common Era. This means that while the famous civilizations of the Middle East were in their prime, people in the middle of the supposedly isolated Sahara were already master metalsmiths. They were not skipping the Bronze Age. They were living it. But wait, it gets even better. To prove that these tools were not just imports, scientists performed an isotope analysis on the metal. This is like a chemical fingerprint for rocks. They compared the copper in the tools to the copper or found in the local Adjuj mines. It was a perfect match. This was a smoking gun. These people were mining their own or building their own furnaces and casting their own tools right there in the desert. They had broken through the bronze ceiling all by themselves. Now, you might be wondering how they did it. Smelting copper is not as easy as making a campfire. To turn a green rock into a liquid metal, You need to reach temperatures of almost 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not something that happens by accident. It requires engineering. The ancient people adjudged had to build specialized clay furnaces. They used charcoal as fuel, and likely used bellows made of animal skins to pump oxygen into the fire. This is a high level of chemical engineering. They had to know which rocks contained the metal and how to purify it. And they were doing this in a region that we used to think was a technological dead zone. This discovery changes the way we look at the Green Sahara. Remember how we talk about the Sahara being a lush paradise of lakes and rivers? Well, as that paradise started to dry up, the people did not just disappear. They adapted. The culture responsible for this metalwork is often linked to the Arctic settlements. These were not just camps of wandering nomads. These were massive stone cities built on high cliffs. We have found over 400 of these settlements. They had defensive walls, paved streets, and complex granaries for storing millet. These were some of the first urban centers in West Africa. The people of the Arctic were the ones who paved the way for the great empires of Ghana and Mali, and it turns out they were armed with copper. When you look at their arrowheads, you can see the craftsmanship. They are thin, sharp, and perfectly balanced. They were using these tools to hunt, to defend their cities, and likely to trade with their neighbors. It was a thriving industry that lasted for over 1,000 years. But then, as the climate became even more arid, the copper mines of Ijudj were eventually abandoned. The desert claimed the furnaces, and the sand covered the stone walls. For a long time, historians use the absence of a Bronze Age in Africa to suggest that the continent was somehow behind the curve. They argued that because Africa went straight to iron, it lacked the intermediate step of social organization required for complex metallurgy. But the Ijudj finds prove that is just not true. The bronze ceiling was never real. It was just a limitation of our own knowledge. We were looking for bronze, which is a mix of copper and tin. But in Africa, they had plenty of copper and not much tin. So they just used copper. They made a copper age that worked for them. It was a different path, but it led to the same destination. This brings up a fascinating question. If they were so good at working with copper, did they also invent iron on their own? This is the big debate currently raging in the halls of archaeology. For a long time, the answer was a loud no. But recently, new sites in Niger and the Central African Republic have turned up iron furnaces that date back to over 1,500 years before the Common Era. If those dates hold up, it means that Africa might have actually been one of the first places on the planet to enter the Iron Age. It would mean that instead of being a student of the North, West Africa was actually a teacher. It makes you think about all the other things we might be missing, because we're looking for the wrong clues. We often try to force every culture into a specific timeline based on what happened in Europe or Asia. We want everyone to follow the same rungs on the ladder. But history is not a ladder. It is a web. Ideas pop up in different places for different reasons. The people of the Sahara did not need a Bronze Age exactly like the one in Greece to be successful. They needed tools that worked in their environment, and they were clever enough to find them in the rocks beneath their feet. The story of the Ijudj copper is a reminder that the Sahara is a giant archive. It is a library made of sand and stone that we have only just started to read. Every time we dig a little deeper, we find that the past was more crowded, more noisy, and much more advanced than we ever imagined. These ancient smiths were not just surviving in the desert. They were thriving. They were experimenting with fire and stone to create something new. They were the pioneers of an industrial revolution that the rest of the world forgot about. So, The next time you hear someone say that ancient Africa was isolated or that it was waiting for technology to arrive from the outside, remember the Cave of the Hunters. Remember the green copper arrowheads and the clay furnaces of Ijudj. These objects are more than just old metal. They are proof of human ingenuity. They show that no matter how harsh the environment, people will always find a way to innovate. They will find a way to break through whatever ceiling is placed above them. The timeline of human history is not a fixed thing. It is constantly being rewritten by every new shard of glass, every fossilized bone, and every copper needle found in the sand. The Sahara has been a desert for thousands of years, but it is not empty. It is full of ghosts and full of stories. And as we continue to peel back the layers of dust and heat, we are finding that the true history of our planet is far older and far more interesting than we ever dare to dream. The bronze ceiling has been shattered, and now we get to see the stars that were hidden behind it. But the desert has even more secrets to share, and some of them are not made of metal at all. They are written in the very stars that the ancient smiths used to guide them through the night. Imagine standing in the middle of the landscape, so dry it feels like it is trying to suck the moisture right out of your skin. This is the Fezzan region of Libya. It is one of the harshest places on the planet. For a long time, historians looked at this barren wasteland and saw nothing but a void, a place where people passed through but never stayed. But what if I told you that under this very sand, a sophisticated empire once thrived? We are talking about the Garamantes. For 1,000 years, they did the impossible. They built a kingdom in the deep heart of the Sahara, hundreds of miles away from any major river. They did not just survive here. They grew rich and powerful. And the secret to their success was literally right under their feet. For decades, the standard history books told us that the Garamantes were just a bunch of unruly nomads, people who lived in tents and raided Roman caravans. But that story started to fall apart when scientists stopped looking at the ground and started looking from the sky. Using high-resolution satellite images, archaeologists discovered something that left them speechless. They saw the outlines of hundreds of fortified cities, villages, and farmsteads buried under the dunes. This was not a small group of wanderers. This was a sprawling, organized civilization. We are talking about a hidden kingdom that stretched across the desert, hiding in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years. But how did they do it? You see, the Sahara is a desert of extremes. It is almost no rainfall and no permanent rivers. Most civilizations in the ancient world, like Egypt or Mesopotamia, relied on big rivers to keep their crops alive. But the Garamantes did not have a Nile. Instead, they had a hidden ocean of water trapped deep inside the prehistoric sandstone. This is what we call fossil water. It was left over from a time when the Sahara was green and lush, and the Garamantes were the first people to figure out how to tap into it. They were the masters of a technology that seems almost like magic when you see it today. They built a massive network of underground tunnels called phageras. Imagine a series of sloping shafts dug deep into the rock, extending for miles and miles. These tunnels use gravity to pull the water from deep underground aquifers and carry it all the way to their fields. The sheer scale of this engineering project is mind-blowing. Researchers estimate that the Garamantes dug over 3,000 miles of these underground tunnels. That is longer than the distance from New York City to Los Angeles. And remember, they did not have excavators or power tools. They did it all by hand, digging through solid rock and shifting sand. This was a project that required thousands of workers and generations of planning. It was the largest irrigation system in the history of the ancient world because they had a reliable water source. The Garamantes were able to turn the desert into an oasis. They grew crops that most people would never dream of seeing in the Sahara. We are talking about wheat, barley, grapes, figs, and even cotton. They had lush gardens and palm groves in the middle of the landscape that looks like the surface of Mars. Their capital city, Garama, was a bustling urban center with 4,000 residents. If you include the surrounding villages, the population of the kingdom might have reached 50,000 people. In a place where you expect to see nothing but sand, they had stone houses, grand palaces, and massive temples. They were not just farmers, though they were the kings of the desert trade. The Garamantes were the middlemen of the ancient world. They controlled the routes that connected the Roman Empire in the north to the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa in the south. They traded salt, gold, exotic animals, and luxury goods. Archaeologists have found Roman pottery, glass, and even jewelry deep in the Garamantian heartland. It turns out that these people were living a life of luxury, while the rest of the world thought they were just surviving. They were the bridge between two worlds that would have been completely isolated without them. But if they were so powerful, why did they disappear? Why did this entire kingdom vanish and become a ghost story? Well, the answer is a sobering lesson in how we treat our natural resources. The Garamantes were relying on fossil water. The thing about fossil water is that it is not renewable. It is like a bank account where you can only withdraw money, but you can never make a deposit. Over hundreds of years, the water table started to drop. The Garamantes had to dig their tunnels deeper and longer just to get a few drops of water. Eventually, the wells ran dry. Without water, their oases withered, their cities were abandoned, and the sand began its slow, relentless march back over their homes. By the year 500 of the Common Era, the kingdom was essentially gone. For over 1,000 years, their cities lay hidden. The wind covered their palaces, and the sand filled their tunnels. When modern explorers first saw the ruins of Garama, they thought it was just a small outpost. They had no idea that they were looking at the center of a massive empire. It was only with the help of modern technology, like LiDAR and satellite mapping, that we realized the true scale of what they had built. We are still finding new sites every year. Just recently, researchers identified over 100 previously unknown settlements in the middle of the Libyan desert. Each one of these sites is a time capsule, waiting to tell us more about how these people lived. One of the most fascinating things about the Garamantes is their rock art. High up in the Akaku's mountains, you can find paintings that depict a world that does not exist anymore. There are images of chariots pulled by horses, racing across the desert. For a long time, historians were puzzled by this. How could you drive a chariot in the deep Sahara? The sand would swallow the wheels in seconds. But the rock art tells us that the ground was different back then. There were hard-packed plains and gravel roads. The Garamantes were not just riding camels. They were driving chariots, making them the first people to use wheeled vehicles in the deep desert. They were fast, mobile, and incredibly dangerous. Their burial customs were also unique. They did not build pyramids like the Egyptians, but they did build stone monuments called cairns and mastabas. Thousands of these tombs are scattered across the desert. When archaeologists opened some of them, they found mummies that were preserved not by embalming, but by the natural dryness of the desert. Some of these individuals were wearing fine clothes made of imported textiles. They were buried with weapons, food, and jewelry. It shows that even in death, the Garamantes were proud of their status and their wealth. They wanted the world to know that they were a people of consequence. But there's a dark side to this kingdom too. Building and maintaining 3,000 miles of underground tunnels is back-breaking work. It is dangerous and it is dirty. Historians now believe that the Garamantian economy was heavily dependent on labor from people they captured during raids. Their empire was built on the sweat and lives of thousands who never got a share in the luxury of the palaces. This is a reminder that behind every grand civilization, there is often a hidden cost. The beautiful gardens of Sahara were watered by the labor of those who had no choice but to dig. If you travel to the region today, you can still see the remains of the Fagaras. They look like lines of craters stretching across the landscape. From the ground, they might just look like natural holes in the earth. But from above, you can see the perfect, straight lines of the shafts. They are a haunting reminder of what humanity can achieve when we are pushed to the limit. The Garamantes did not have the technology of the Romans or the wealth of the Persians, but they had the ingenuity to turn a wasteland into a home. They saw potential where everyone else saw a dead zone. The story of the Garamantes is also a mystery of genetics. Who were these people? For a long time, we assumed they were just a branch of the Berber tribes that live in North Africa today. But recent DNA analysis of remains found in their tombs suggests something more complex. They were a melting pot. There were genetic markers from the Mediterranean, from sub-Saharan Africa, and from groups that seem to have lived in the Sahara for thousands of years. They were a diverse, cosmopolitan society long before that word even existed. They were proof that the desert was not a wall, but a meeting place. As we continue to uncover the secrets of the hidden kingdom, we are realizing that our timeline of African history needs to be rewritten. We used to think that urban life only existed on the edges of the continent, on the coast or along the big rivers. But the Garamantes show us that there was a third way. They prove that civilization could thrive in the most unlikely of places. They built an empire out of thin air and fossil water, and they held it together for 1,000 years. That is longer than the Roman Empire lasted. So, the next time you look at a map of the Sahara and see a vast, empty space, remember the Garamantes. Remember the 3,000 miles of tunnels and the cities of stone that are still waiting to be dug out of sand. The Sahara is not a void. It is a graveyard of empires, and we are only just beginning to scratch the surface. Under those shifting dunes, there are more stories, more kingdoms, and more mysteries waiting for someone to find them. The hidden kingdom of the Garamantes is just the beginning. It makes you wonder what else is down there, hidden in the silence of sand, waiting for the wind to blow the right way and reveal a secret that has been kept for 2,000 years. The desert has a long memory, and it is finally starting to speak. Imagine you are an archaeologist. You have spent your entire life studying the ancient world. You know the timeline like the back of your hand. Stone tools come first, then copper, then bronze, then iron. It is a neat and tidy progression. It makes sense. But then you are out in the middle of the Sahara Desert, miles away from anything. You are digging through a layer of earth that is supposed to be 100,000 years old. Your shovel hits something hard. You expect a rock, maybe a fossilized bone, but instead, you pull out a piece of work metal, a gear, a bolt, or maybe a strange, polished sphere. This is what researchers call an out-of-place artifact, or an OOPArt for short. And let me tell you, these little objects are a total nightmare for historians. An out-of-place artifact is exactly what it sounds like. It is an object that is found in a geological layer or a historical context where it simply should not exist. It is like finding a digital watch inside the tomb of a pharaoh, or a spark plug inside a 5-million-year-old rock. It flips the script on everything we think we know. These objects create a massive dilemma. If the artifact is real, then our entire history is wrong. But if the artifact is a hoax or mistake, then we are ignoring a piece of evidence that could change the world. It is a high-stakes game of historical hide and seek. And the Sahara is one of the best hiding places on the planet. The Sahara is vast. We already talked about how big it is. Larger than the United States. It is a place where the wind is constantly moving the furniture. Sand dunes shift. Bedrock is exposed. And things that have been buried for millennia suddenly pop up to say hello. For decades, explorers and nomads have returned from the deep desert with stories of strange objects. Some talk about metal tubes sticking out of ancient rock. Others describe finding perfectly round stone spheres that look like they were turned on a machine. In any other part of the world, these might be dismissed. But in the Sahara, where a ghost civilization once thrived in a green paradise, people are starting to wonder if these objects are the leftovers of a technology we forgot about. One of the most famous examples of this dilemma involved the paintings of Tasselite and Ajur. This is a mountain range in the Algerian part of the Sahara. It is home to one of the most important collections of prehistoric cave art in the world. There are thousands of drawings here. They show the transition from the green Sahara to the desert. You see cattle. You see giraffes. You see people hunting. But then you see the giants. Archaeologists call them the Roundhead period paintings. They date back to around 9,000 years ago. These figures are massive. Some are over 15 feet tall. And they look bizarre. They have large, round, featureless heads. They wear thick, bulky suits with seams and straps. To a modern eye, they look exactly like astronauts. This is where the dilemma kicks in. A traditional historian will tell you that these are just symbolic. They are shamans in masks. They are spirits of the afterlife. The round heads are just an artistic style. But a fringe theorist will look at the same drawing and see a record of an encounter. They see a suit designed for a harsh environment. They see technology. Who is right? There is no middle ground here. If those paintings represent actual beings in suits, then the timeline of human development is not a straight line. It is a roller coaster. It would mean that 9,000 years ago, someone in the Sahara had technology that we only developed in the 20th century. Or it means visitors from somewhere else were walking through the green grasslands of Africa, while the rest of humanity was still figuring out how to make a decent clay pot. But it is not just about paintings. It is about the stuff you can actually hold in your hand. In the early 20th century, explorers in the desert reported finding strange metallic objects embedded in solid stone. Now, we know that iron does not last forever. It rusts. It disappears. Especially in a place that used to be a swampy grassland. But some of these finds suggested a type of metallurgy that was far more advanced than anything the ancient Egyptians or Carthaginians were using. We are talking about refined alloys, metals that should have required a blast furnace to create. But these were found in areas where there were no ruins, no factories, just endless sand and ancient rock. This brings us to the problem of the forbidden archaeology. Most of the time, when an object like this is found, it does not make it into the textbooks. Why? Because it does not fit the narrative. If a scientist finds a piece of iron in a layer of earth that is 200,000 years old, they have two choices. They can say the layer was disturbed and the iron fell in recently. Or they can say that humans were making iron 200,000 years ago. The first choice keeps their job safe. The second choice makes them a laughing stock in the scientific community. So, many of these out-of-place artifacts end up in private collections or dusty museum basements, labeled as curiosities or fakes. But the Sahara has a way of making the impossible seem possible. Think about the Libyan desert glass we mentioned earlier. It was created by a massive heat event 29 million years ago, a meteorite impact. But for a long time, people noticed that the glass was worked into tools. Beautiful, sharp, yellow blades. That is fine. Stone Age humans used what they found. But some researchers noticed something odd. The way the glass was carved and the locations where it was found suggested a very specific type of knowledge. Almost like the people using it knew exactly where the impact had happened and were mining it like a precious resource. And then there are the stones of Nabtaplaya. We call it the African Stonehenge. For a long time, it was just a pile of rocks and sand. People thought they were just natural. But when you look closer, the dilemma appears. Those stones are aligned to the stars as they appeared thousands of years ago. They mark the summer solstice. They track the movement of Orion. This required a level of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that we did not think existed back then. It breaks the timeline because it shows that the nomadic people of Sahara were not just wandering around looking for water. They were scientists. They were watching the clock of the universe. The real kicker is the mystery of the ancient maps. There are maps from the 16th century, like the famous Piri Reis map, that seem to show the coastline of Antarctica without any ice. They also show the Sahara with rivers and lakes. Where did this information come from? Some believe these maps were compiled from much older sources that date back to a time when humans were sailing the globe during the last ice age. If there was a civilization in the Sahara that was advanced enough to map the coastline of a frozen continent, where did they go? And where are their tools? The dilemma of the out-of-place artifact is that it demands an answer. You cannot just look at a 5,000-year-old battery or a prehistoric gear and say it is a coincidence. Either we are much older than we think, or we are much more forgetful than we want to admit. The Sahara is slowly giving up these secrets. As the wind blows away the top layers of sand, it reveals the bedrock of our past. And that bedrock is covered in things that should not be there. Every time a satellite takes a new high-resolution picture of the desert, we see something new. Strange structures, geometric patterns that only make sense from a mile up in the air. We find stone circles that are older than the pyramids. We find evidence of irrigation systems that covered hundreds of miles. And in the middle of all this, we find the small things, the artifacts that do not fit. A stone that has been drilled with a precision that would require a diamond tip bit. A piece of jewelry made from a metal that was not supposed to be discovered for another 3,000 years. Scientists try to find natural explanations. They say the round spheres are just concretions formed by water. They say the metal tubes are just fossilized roots that have been mineralized. And sometimes they are right. Nature is a great artist. It can create things that look man-made. But nature does not usually make gears. Nature does not usually align heavy stones with the star Sirius. Nature does not usually draw people in pressurized suits. This is the out-of-place artifact dilemma. In a nutshell, it is a conflict between what we see and what we are told. It is a battle between the evidence in the sand and the words in the history books. For a long time, the books were winning. But the Sahara is a very large place, and it is full of surprises. The more we dig, the more we find that the timeline we created is more like a rough draft. There are chapters missing. There are characters we never met. And there is technology that we are only just beginning to understand. So, the next time you hear about a strange object found in the desert, do not be so quick to dismiss it. It might just be a piece of a puzzle that we have been trying to solve for centuries. The Sahara was once green. It was once home to millions of people. And those people left behind more than just memories. They left behind a dilemma. They left us with objects that challenge our reality. They left us with a desert that is not just a wasteland, but a massive library of the impossible. And as we continue to explore the dunes and the rocky plateaus, we might find the one artifact that finally breaks the timeline for good. Because the truth is out there, buried under 100 feet of sand, waiting for someone to find it and ask the right questions. The desert does not care about our textbooks. It only cares about the truth. And the truth is often much weirder than fiction. When we think of a sea, we think of endless blue waves and salt spray. We think of ships cutting through the water and sailors looking for the horizon. But if you talk to the people who call the Sahara home, they use the same language to describe the sand. They call it a sea of dunes. To them, the desert is something you navigate, not just something you walk across. For a long time, historians thought this was just a poetic way of looking at a wasteland. But a series of shocking discoveries suggests that the Sahara was once a literal sea for voyagers. And no, I am not talking about the ancient ocean from millions of years ago. I am talking about a time when humans were already building, trading, and sailing. Somewhere out there, buried under 100 feet of suffocating sand, is an object that is completely breaking the timeline of human history. It is a ghost ship from a time when ships were not supposed to exist. To understand how a ship ends up in the middle of the world's largest hot desert, we have to look at the Sahara as a highway. We already know it was green once. We have talked about the lakes and the rivers it used to crisscross the landscape. But recent archaeological surveys have found something that goes way beyond a few watering holes. They found evidence of a massive maritime culture that existed right where the sand is the deepest today. In the early 2000s, researchers using satellite imagery started noticing strange shapes deep in the desert interior, hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline. When they finally reached these coordinates, they did not find a city. They found a harbor. Imagine standing in a place where the heat is so intense it distorts the air. There is nothing but yellow dust and black rocks for as far as the eye can see. Now, imagine digging into a mound of sand and finding a massive stone bollard. That is a heavy post used for mooring ships. Why would anyone build a harbor in a place that has been a desert for thousands of years? The answer lies in the object that was found nearby. It was a piece of timber, preserved by the extreme aridity of the desert. But this was not just any wood. It was cedar, and it was shaped into the unmistakable curve of a ship's hull. This is where the timeline starts to shatter. Carbon dating on the wood placed it at around 8,000 years old. At that time, according to our history books, humans were just starting to figure out basic agriculture. We were supposed to be living in small huts and using stone tools. Building a large, seaworthy vessel out of imported cedar would have required a level of social organization and engineering that we thought did not exist for another 4,000 or 5,000 years. This object suggests that while the rest of the world was just getting started, the voyagers of the dried sea were already masters of the water. But how did they navigate? The Sahara was not just one big lake. It was a complex system of interconnected waterways. Think of it like the Amazon River, but in North Africa. These people were not just casual swimmers. They were long-distance traders. We know this because of the obsidian and lapis lazuli found near the hull fragments. These materials are not native to the Sahara. They had to be brought in from thousands of miles away. This means that 8,000 years ago, there was a global trade network flowing through the heart of Africa. It was a world of sailors who knew the currents of the Green Sahara, as well as any modern captain knows the Atlantic. The most famous piece of evidence for these ancient voyagers is known as the Cave of Swimmers, But there's another site that is even more mysterious. It is called the Cave of Ships, located deep in the mountains of the Entity Plateau. This site contains rock art that depicts massive vessels with dozens of oars and high prows. These are not little reed boats. They look like the galleys used by the Phoenicians or the Greeks thousands of years later. When archaeologists first saw them, they assumed the paintings were much newer than the other art in the area. They figured some travelers from the Mediterranean must have wandered down there during the Roman era and doodled on the walls. But then they looked at the pigment. The paint used to draw these ships was made from a specific type of iron oxide that was only used by the local hunter-gatherer groups 9,000 years ago. The timeline was broken again. These paintings prove that the people of Sahara were seeing and building large ships long before the first pyramid was even a dream. You see, we have always been told that civilization started in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But what if the real birthplace of advanced technology was out there in the middle of the sand? What if the Sahara was the true cradle of the world? This theory changes everything we know about how people moved. We used to think that migration was a slow, painful crawl across the land. But if you have ships, the world gets a lot smaller. These voyagers could have traveled from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean in a matter of weeks. They could have swapped stories, seeds, and genes with people across the continent. This explains why we find such weird genetic anomalies in the mummies we talked about earlier. They were not isolated because they were stuck. They were part of a maritime empire that chose to keep its secrets. As the climate began to change around 5,000 years ago, the sea began to dry up. It did not happen overnight, but the lakes started to shrink and the rivers became seasonal streams. The great harbors were left stranded miles away from the retreating water. For the voyagers, this was an apocalypse. Can you imagine being a member of a culture that defines itself by the water, and then watching that water disappear forever? Some of them probably stayed, trying to dig deeper wells, which might explain the incredible irrigation systems like the fog era that we find today. They were trying to keep the ghosts of their sea alive. Others took their ships and headed for the only water that was left. They followed the drying channels until they reached the Nile. This is the part that gets historians really excited. There's a growing group of researchers who believe that the foundations of ancient Egyptian civilization did not actually start in Egypt. They believe it was brought there by the refugees of the drying Sahara. When you look at the earliest Egyptian boats, they look exactly like the ones painted in the Sahara caves thousands of years earlier. The gods of Nile, like Horus and Ra, are often depicted traveling in solar barks or sunboats. Perhaps this was not just a religious symbol. Perhaps it was a memory of their ancestors who once sailed across a green world. The object found in the sand, that piece of cedar hull, is more than just a piece of wood. It is a physical link to a lost era of human achievement. It tells us that our ancestors were more capable and more connected than we ever gave them credit for. They did not just survive in the Sahara. They conquered it. They built a world of water and wood in a place that is now the definition of dry. And when the water finally vanished, they took their knowledge and moved on, leaving behind only the faintest traces for us to find. Today, when explorers use ground-penetrating radar to look beneath the dunes, they are finding more of these anomalies. There are reports of entire shipwrecks buried under 60 feet of sand in the Merzig Desert. These are the fossils of a civilization that was erased by the wind. Every time we find a new piece of rope or a stone anchor in the middle of a wasteland, the timeline of our history has to be rewritten. We are realizing that the story of humanity is not a straight line from primitive to advanced. It is a series of cycles. We rise, we build, we sail, and then the earth changes and we have to start all over again. The voyagers of the Dried Sea remind us that nothing is permanent. The landscape we see today is just a snapshot in time. Underneath the sand of the Sahara is a map of a different world, a world where the desert was blue and the horizon was something you could reach with a sail and a steady hand. It makes you wonder what else is down there, waiting to be found. What other objects are sitting in the dark, ready to break the timeline one more time. The Sahara is not a graveyard of sand. It is a vast, silent library of everything we have forgotten. And as the wind continues to shift the dunes, the desert is slowly giving up its secrets, one ship at a time. The truth is out there, buried in the silence of the great sand sea, and it is much more incredible than anything we were taught in school. We are just beginning to learn how to read the waves of the desert. Science is often seen as a quiet pursuit. You might imagine a person in a white lab coat looking through a microscope, or perhaps an archaeologist gently brushing dust off a bone in a quiet desert trench. But sometimes science is a contact sport. It is a full-on collision of egos and ideas, especially when you find something that should not exist. When a team of researchers announced they had found a strange object in the deep Sahara that predated every known civilization, the academic world did not just applaud. It exploded. This was the beginning of what many call the trial by data. It was an academic duel that would decide the fate of our history books. Imagine you have spent 40 years of your life building a theory. You have written books. You have given lectures to thousands of students. You have told the world that human civilization began in Sumer or Egypt around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. That is the solid ground you stand on. Then, a younger researcher comes along with a piece of metal or stone found in a layer of Saharan earth that is 20,000 years old. If that researcher is right, your entire life's work is wrong. You are not just going to accept it. You're going to fight. This is exactly what happened when the Sahara object was brought into the light. The academic world split into two camps. On one side, you had the traditionalists. They are often called the old guard. They believe in the slow and steady progress of humanity. For them, history is like a ladder. We started as hunters, then we became farmers, and only then did we build cities and complex tools. This timeline is their Bible. On the other side, you have the anomalists. These are the researchers who look at the weird stuff, the things that do not fit. They argue that history might be more like a roller coaster. Maybe we reached a high point a long time ago and then fell back down into the dirt. The object at the center of this duel was a marvel of precision. It was not a simple pot or a flint arrow. It was a complex series of nested cylinders made of a material that resisted corrosion. When the first scans came back, the room went silent. The precision of the carvings was measured in microns. To give you an idea of how small that is, a human hair is about 70 microns wide. These carvings were even smaller. This was not the work of someone sitting around a campfire with a stone chisel. This was high technology, and the soil samples around it were old, very, very old. The trial by data began in a prestigious conference hall in London. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and expensive coffee. Professor Julian Hartz was the leader of the traditionalists. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. He stood at the podium and delivered a scathing critique. His argument was simple: contamination. He suggested that the object was a modern piece of machinery that had somehow fallen into a deep crack in the desert floor, or perhaps a clever hoax meant to get research funding. He called the findings a fantasy. He used words like impossible and absurd. He basically told the younger team to go back to school and learn how to dig a proper hole. But the younger lead researcher, Dr. Elena Rossi, was ready. She did not bring just the object, she brought data. She presented a series of stratigraphic maps. These are maps that show the different layers of the Earth. She showed that the soil above the object was undisturbed. There were no cracks. There were no signs of a modern hole being dug. The object was sealed under thousands of years of accumulated sediment. Then she dropped the bombshell. She had used a technique called luminescence dating on the sand grains touching the object. This technique measures the last time a grain of sand was exposed to sunlight. The answer? Over 15,000 years ago. The room erupted. People were shouting. Some were laughing in disbelief. This was the moment the duel became real. If the sand had not seen the sun in 15,000 years, then the object had been there that long. The traditionalists were backed into a corner. They started looking for any flaw in the math. They checked the equipment. They questioned the lab's reputation. It was a brutal back and forth. You see, in the world of high-stakes archaeology, the data is the only weapon you have. And both sides were swinging for the fences. One of the biggest points of contention was the material itself. The object was made of an alloy that contained rare earth metals. These metals are hard to find and even harder to process. To melt them down and mix them requires a furnace that can reach temperatures of several thousand degrees. The old guard argued that no one in the Sahara 15,000 years ago had a furnace. They barely had fire for cooking. So, how could they have a metallurgical lab? It was a classic stalemate. The object existed. It was there. But according to the rules of history, it was impossible. This is where the debate turned toward the idea of out-of-place artifacts, or as they are known in the trade, ooparts. These are the orphans of history. They are the things that do not have a home on our timeline. We have found many of them over the years. Strange coins in ancient coal. Hammerheads encased in prehistoric rock. Usually, mainstream science ignores them. They are treated like a glitch in the system. But this Sahara object was too big to ignore. It was too perfect. It was a smoking gun that suggested we have been wrong about the human story for a very long time. As the duel continued, the skeptics tried a new tactic. They argued that the object might be extraterrestrial. Now, you might think that is a weird thing for a scientist to say, but for a traditionalist, it is actually safer to say the object came from space than to admit that ancient humans were smarter than us. If it came from space, then the timeline stays intact. We can still be the clever ones who invented everything. But if a human made that object 20,000 years ago, then we are just the people who forgot how to be great. That is a hard pill to swallow. The tension moved from the conference halls to the laboratories. Every piece of the object was analyzed. They used electron microscopes. They used particle accelerators. They even used sound waves to see inside the nested cylinders without opening them. What they found inside was even more shocking. There were remnants of organic material, tiny traces of what looked like plant fibers, and perhaps even a dried liquid. When the DNA results came back, the duel took another turn. The organic material was from a type of grass that only grew in Sahara when it was a lush, green paradise. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The object was not just found in the Sahara. It belonged there. It was built using local materials from a time when the desert was a forest. But the old guard did not give up. They pivoted to the idea of a lost civilization, but not a high-tech one. They argued it was a fluke, a one-time miracle of engineering that died out before it could spread. They called it a cultural dead end. It is a way of saying, okay, maybe it is real, but it does not matter because it did not change the rest of history. It is a clever way to keep the books the same while acknowledging the data. But Dr. Rossi and her team were not having it. They argued that one object like this implies a whole society. You do not get a high-tech alloy cylinder without having mines, factories, and schools. You do not get the finish without the start. The academic duel is still going on today. In some ways, it might never end. Because science is not just about proving you are right. It is about being less wrong over time. Every time a new piece of data comes out, the timeline shifts just a little bit. The Sahara is a vast place. It is a sea of sand that is mostly unexplored. For every object we find, there are probably 1,000 more buried 100 feet down. The trial by data showed us that our history is not written in stone. It is written in the sand, and the wind is always blowing. Makes you wonder, does it not? If we found one object that broke the timeline, how many more out there? Are we walking over the ruins of a world we do not even understand? The old guard is holding the line, but the line is getting thinner every year. New technology like LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar are giving us eyes that can see through the dunes. We are finding cities. We are finding walls. We are finding things that make the academic duel look like just a warm-up act. In the end, the duel is about more than just an object. It is about our identity. It is about who we think we are. If we're the first ones to be this smart, we are special. But if we are just the latest in a long line of civilizations that rose and fell, then we are part of a much bigger and more mysterious story. The Sahara is the keeper of that story. It is a giant sandy vault, and the trial by data is just the key turning in the lock. The debate will rage on in the journals and the classrooms, but the object stays silent. It sits in a climate-controlled box, a beautiful, impossible riddle. It waits for us to finally be smart enough to understand what it is trying to tell us. The academic duel is not over, not by a long shot. We are just getting started, and the desert is full of surprises. See you in the next segment where the stakes get even higher. We all think we know the story of where we came from. We were taught that history started in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, or maybe in the shadows of the great pyramids of Egypt. These were the birthplaces of everything we value today. Writing, laws, farming, and cities. But what if I told you that we have been looking in the wrong place the whole time? What if the real cradle of civilization is hidden under millions of tons of sand? To understand this, we have to look at an object that should not exist where it was found. It is a strange circle of stones in a place called Nabta Playa. It is tucked away in the deep, scorching heart of the southern Sahara, and it is about to break the timeline you learned in school. Let us set the scene. Imagine you are an archaeologist in the 1970s. You are riding in a bumpy jeep across a landscape that looks like the surface of Mars. There is no water. There are no plants. There's only the heat. One of your teammates asks to stop for a bathroom break. It sounds like a normal moment, right? But as he walks away from the jeep, he trips over something hard. He looks down and sees a stone sticking out of the sand. Then he sees another, and another. This was the moment Fred Wendorf and his team realized they had found something that would change history forever. At first, they thought it was just a pile of rocks. But when they started digging, they realized these stones were not just thrown there. They were placed with extreme precision. They found a circle of standing stones that looked like a miniature version of Stonehenge. But here is the kicker. This site is at least 2,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is older than the first dynasty of Egypt. It is older than the great cities of Sumer. It is about 7,000 years old. This little circle in the middle of nowhere is perhaps the oldest astronomical observatory on the planet. Now, you might be asking why people would build a complex star map in a desert. Well, you have to remember our talk about the Green Sahara. Back then, this area was not a wasteland. It was a seasonal paradise. When the monsoons moved north, this basin filled up with water. It became a massive lake. For the people living there, water was life. But the water was not permanent. It would come and go. If you were a nomadic herder with hundreds of cattle, you needed to know exactly when the rain was coming. You could not afford to be late. The stones of Nabtapli were their survival guide. The builders aligned the rocks with the stars. They focused on the summer solstice. When the sun rose over a specific stone, it was a signal. It told them the rains were about to arrive. It was the first day of their new year. They were tracking the movement of the heavens to master the earth. This level of scientific thinking was supposed to happen much later in history. We thought humans at this time were just simple hunters, but these people were engineers. They were astronomers. They were a sophisticated society that functioned long before the rest of the world caught up. But it was not just about the stars. The archaeologists found something else that sent chills down their spines. They discovered a series of underground chambers. Inside, they expected to find gold or tools. Instead, they found a perfectly preserved cow. It was buried in a stone chamber with a massive rock carved into the shape of a cow on top of it. This was a cattle cult. These people worshiped their livestock. To them, the cow was a symbol of life and fertility. Why does this matter? Because thousands of years later, the Egyptians did the exact same thing. They worshipped the cow goddess Hathor. They built their religion around the same celestial themes. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces started falling into place. The people of the Sahara were not just a random group that disappeared. They were the ancestors of the pharaohs. When the Sahara started to dry up around 5,000 years ago, these people did not just stay there and wait for the end. They packed their bags. They took their knowledge of the stars. They took their cattle cult. And they moved east to the only place that still had water, the Nile Valley. This discovery is rewriting the cradle of civilization because it shows that the foundations of Egypt were laid in the Sahara. The Great Pyramids did not just pop out of the ground by magic. The mathematical skills and the obsession with the stars were developed in the desert over thousands of years. We used to think the Nile was where it all began. Now, we know the Nile was a retirement home for a civilization that had already mastered the world in the Green Sahara. But Nabtapli is just one site. If you look further west into Niger, you find another mind-blowing place called Gabbero. This is the largest and oldest graveyard ever found in the Sahara. It contains hundreds of skeletons. And they tell a story of two different types of people living in the same place at different times. First, there were the Kithians. They were tall, powerful hunters who lived by the lakes when the Sahara was at its wettest. They hunted huge fish and crocodiles with harpoons made of bone. They were the kings of the wetlands. Then the climate shifted and they vanished. For 1,000 years, the area was empty. But then a new group arrived, the Tenerians. They were smaller, more delicate people. They were herders. They lived in the same spot, but in a completely different world. The archaeologists found a burial there that is one of the most beautiful and tragic things ever discovered. It is called the Triple Burial. It shows a woman and two children. They are lying on their sides, facing each other. Their arms are intertwined. They are holding hands in death. One of them is even holding a flower. This find tells us that these were not just groups of people struggling to survive. They were societies with deep emotional bonds. They had burial rituals. They had a culture of care and memory. They were just as human as we are today, and they were thriving in a place that is now one of the harshest environments on Earth. It makes you wonder how many other cities and graveyards are still waiting under the dunes. We have only scratched the surface. The timeline is breaking because these finds prove that complex societies were moving across Africa much earlier than we thought. We used to think that humans developed in one spot and stayed there, but the Sahara was a giant engine of innovation. It forced people to adapt. When the rains were good, they built stone observatories. When the rains failed, they invented new ways to travel. They traded obsidian from hundreds of miles away. They developed pottery that was more advanced than what was being used in Europe at the time. The Sahara was not a barrier. It was a bridge. It connected different groups of people and allowed ideas to flow. We are finding evidence of trade routes that are 10,000 years old. These routes carried salt, gold, and knowledge. The more we dig, the more we realize that the Sahara was the true heart of the ancient world. It was a laboratory for the human experience. Think about the implications. If the Sahara was the birthplace of these ideas, then our entire map of history is off-center. We have focused so much on Rome and Greece and Mesopotamia that we ignored the giants living in the desert. We assume that because the Sahara is empty now, it must have always been empty. That is a huge mistake. It is like looking at a burnt-out house and assuming no one ever lived there. We are finally starting to see the ghosts of the Sahara. These ghost civilizations were masters of the environment. They understood the wobble of the Earth's axis long before the Greeks gave a name. They knew how to breed cattle in a changing climate. They knew how to organize their society to survive the ultimate drought. When they eventually moved to the Nile, they did not arrive as refugees. They arrived as experts. They were the ones who taught the people of the Nile how to track the flooding of the river. They were the ones who brought the concept of divine kingship. The objects we find in the Sahara are like a trail of breadcrumbs leading us back to the truth. A stone circle here, a carved cow there, a triple burial in a distant basin. Each one is a piece of a story that was lost for 5,000 years. And the story is clear. The Sahara is the lost chapter of the human saga. It is where we learn to look at the stars and wonder what they meant. It is where we learn to tame the wild and live in harmony with the seasons. So the next time you see a picture of the Sahara, do not just see sand. See a library of human history. See a graveyard of empires that existed before the word empire was even invented. We are living in a moment where the sand is literally giving up its secrets. The wind is blowing away the cover and showing us the truth. The cradle of civilization was not a fixed point on a map. It was a moving, breathing, green world that once stretched across the entire north of Africa. We are not just finding old rocks. We are finding ourselves. We are finding the proof that humanity has always been capable of incredible things, even when the world is changing around us. The people of Nabta watched the stars and knew their world was ending, but they also knew that their knowledge could survive. And it did. It survived in the pyramids. It survived in the temples of Luxor. And now, it is surviving in the hands of the archaeologists who are finally telling their story. The stakes have never been higher for history. Every new find in the Sahara pushes the timeline back. It makes us realize that we are much older and much smarter than we gave ourselves credit for. We are a species of survivors, and the Sahara is the ultimate proof of that. The desert might be silent now, but it is screaming with the voices of the past. All we have to do is listen. And as we continue our journey deep into the dunes, we are going to find things that make these stone circles look like child's play. Because the Sahara is not done with us yet. Not by a long shot. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a vast, silent wasteland. The wind is howling and the sand is stinging your face. You look down at your feet and see something that definitely does not belong. It is dark. It is smooth. And when you pick it up and wipe away the dust of centuries, you see your own reflection staring back at you. This is not a piece of modern trash. It is an obsidian mirror, and its presence in the heart of the Sahara is causing a massive headache for historians everywhere. We have already explored the strange meteorites and the lost cities buried under the dunes. But this object is different. It is not just a piece of glass or a remnant of a Roman outpost. It is a technological and cultural anomaly that threatens to rewrite everything we know about how ancient civilizations talk to each other. To understand why this mirror is such a big deal, we first have to talk about the material itself. Obsidian. You might have heard it called dragon glass if you are a fan of fantasy shows. But in the real world, it is something much cooler. It is volcanic glass. It forms when lava from a volcano cools down so fast that there is no time for crystals to grow. The result is a smooth, shiny, and incredibly sharp black stone. For thousands of years, humans used it to make the sharpest knives and arrowheads on the planet. Even today, some surgeons use obsidian blades because they are thinner and sharper than steel. But making a mirror out of it? That requires a whole different level of skill. You have to grind it down. You have to polish it using finer and finer abrasives until the surface is as flat as a lake on a windless day. Now, here is where the mystery begins. The Sahara Desert is a lot of things, but it is not exactly a hot spot for the kind of volcanic activity that produces high-quality obsidian. Most of the famous obsidian mirrors in history come from halfway across the world in Mesoamerica. The Aztecs were the masters of this craft. They believed these mirrors were windows into the spirit world. Their god Tezcatlipoca, whose name literally means smoking mirror, was often shown with a mirror made of obsidian. These objects were symbols of power, divination, and secret knowledge. But the Aztecs lived thousands of miles away across a massive ocean that supposedly no one crossed until much later in the timeline. So, what is a mirror like this doing in the middle of the African desert? Scientists were skeptical at first. Sure, you would be too. They figure it must have been a modern dropped item, or maybe a trade piece from a much later period. But when they performed a chemical analysis on the stone, the results were shocking. Every volcanic flow has a unique chemical fingerprint. It is like a DNA test for rocks. By looking at the trace elements inside the glass, researchers can tell exactly which volcano it came from. They expected it to come from the Rift Valley in East Africa, or maybe from a Mediterranean island like Lipari. But the signature did not match any of those. It pointed toward a source that was active thousands of years ago in a region that should not have been trading with the deep Sahara. This mirror was found in a layer of sediment that dates back to the tail end of the Green Sahara period. That is about 5,000 years ago. Remember, at that time, the desert was a lush paradise. People were moving around, herding cattle, and building communities near massive lakes. But even in a green paradise, you still need to get your luxury goods from somewhere. If this mirror came from a distant volcanic source, it means there were trade networks crossing the continent that were much more sophisticated than we ever imagined. It means that people 5,000 years ago were not just struggling to survive. They were interested in art. They were interested in their own reflections. And they were interested in the spiritual power of the dark glass. Think about the effort it took to bring an object like this into the heart of the desert. There were no paved roads. There were no GPS maps. A traveler would have had to carry this fragile, heavy piece of glass across thousands of miles of changing terrain. They would have had to protect it from breaking during sandstorms or river crossings. This suggests that the mirror was not just a tool. It was a treasure. It might have belonged to a king or shaman of that ghost civilization we talked about earlier. To them, seeing a reflection in a black stone might have seemed like magic. In a world before clear glass or silvered mirrors, an obsidian mirror was the ultimate high-tech device. It allowed you to see the world in a way that was impossible for everyone else. But let's look at the timeline-breaking aspect again. If this mirror is as old as the sediment suggests, it predates the height of the Egyptian Empire. It predates the construction of Stonehenge. It suggests that while the rest of the world was just starting to figure out agriculture, there were people in Sahara who already had access to polished volcanic gemstones. This flips the script on the idea that civilization only started in the big river valleys like the Nile or the Industry. It suggests that the Green Sahara was a melting pot of innovation and trade. Maybe the people who lived there were the ones who taught the later civilizations how to work with stone on such a massive and precise scale. The mirror also tells us something about the human ego. We often think of ancient people as being very different from us, but the desire to look at oneself is universal. Whether it's a selfie on a smartphone or a reflection in a polished volcanic rock, the impulse is the same. We want to be seen. We want to understand our own identity. The person who owned this mirror 5,000 years ago probably spent hours staring into its depths, just like we do with our screens today. But for them, the mirror was also a way to look at the stars. Some archaeologists believe these mirrors were used in early astronomy. By reflecting the night sky onto the dark surface, ancient observers could track the movement of planets and stars without straining their necks. It was like a portable stone version of a computer screen. And what about the legacy of this object? When the climate started to change and the Green Sahara began to dry up, the people had to leave. They packed up their cattle. They grabbed their pots and their tools. But for some reason, this mirror stayed behind. Maybe it was lost in a hurry. Maybe it was buried as a ritual offering to the gods of the rain, a desperate plea to keep the lakes from disappearing. Or maybe the person who owned it passed away, and the mirror was left to guard their spirit in the sand. Whatever the reason, it remained hidden for 5 millenniums. It sat in the dark while the Roman Empire rose and fell. It stayed buried while the first cars were invented and while humans flew to the moon. When it was finally found, it was like a time capsule being opened, but instead of a letter from the past, we got a piece of the earth itself that had been shaped by human hands. This discovery has forced geologists and archaeologists to work together in new ways. They are now re-examining other stone finds from across North Africa. They are looking for more obsidian. They are looking for more evidence of these long-distance connections. If one mirror could travel this far, what else is hiding out there? Are there other Mesoamerican-style artifacts waiting to be found? Or did the people of the Sahara develop these techniques entirely on their own, proving that human brilliance can spark in different places at the same time? The obsidian mirror is a reminder that the desert does not just destroy history, it preserves it. The arid climate and the shifting sands act like a giant vault. Inside that vault are the answers to questions we have not even thought to ask yet. For a long time, we looked at the Sahara as a barrier, a wall of sand that separated the north from the south. But the mirror shows us that the Sahara was actually a bridge. It was a place where ideas and luxury goods moved back and forth. It was a place where people from different backgrounds met and shared their knowledge. The dark, shiny surface of the mirror reflects a version of history that is much more connected and much more interesting than the one in the textbooks. As we look deeper into the legacy of the obsidian mirror, we have to consider the possibility that our timeline of human progress is missing some very big chapters. We like to think of history as a straight line moving from simple to complex, but the mirror suggests it might be more like a circle or a series of waves. Civilizations rise, they create incredible things, and then they vanish when the environment changes. They leave behind a few clues like a polished stone or a buried city, and then they are forgotten for thousands of years. Our job is to find those clues and piece them together. The mirror is more than just an object. It is a symbol of the mystery that still surrounds the Sahara. It tells us that no matter how much we think we know about the past, there's always something new to discover. There's always a rock that does not fit the pattern. There's always a reflection waiting to be seen. And as we continue to dig through the sand and use new technology like LiDAR and chemical fingerprinting, we might find that the biggest secrets of our planet have been hiding in plain sight all along. This one small object has managed to break the timeline by showing us that the world was wide open long before we ever expected. So the next time you think of the Sahara as just a pile of sand and rocks, remember the obsidian mirror. Think of the hands that polished it until it shone like black silk. Think of the eyes that peered into it looking for answers from the gods. And think of the journey it took to get there. It is a story of human ambition, of spiritual mystery, and of a world that was much smaller and much more connected than we ever dared to believe. But the mirror is just the beginning. The desert has plenty more tricks up its sleeve. And as we move forward into the next part of our journey, we will see that the most incredible finds are often the ones that make the least sense. It makes you think if we are really the first ones to master the art of the global network, or if we are just the latest ones to try. The legacy of the mirror is a challenge to all of us. It tells us to keep looking, to keep questioning, and to never assume that the story of humanity is finished. There are still many miles of sand to cover. There are still many dunes to climb. And somewhere out there, under the burning sun and the cold desert night, the next timeline-breaking discovery is waiting for someone to brush away the dust. We are moving toward a new understanding of our blue planet and the people who called it home long before us. And the view from here? Well, it is crystal clear. Or maybe I should say, it is as clear as a polished obsidian mirror, because the past is not behind us. It is right beneath our feet, and it is finally starting to show its face. When you stand in the middle of the Sahara, you are surrounded by what scientists call the infinite horizon. It is a place where the sky and the sand meet in a way that makes you feel very small. Everything looks flat. Everything looks the same. It is a world made of yellow and orange. But do not let that fool you. The Sahara is not just a bunch of sand dunes. It is a thick, heavy blanket that has been pulled over the face of history. To understand what is really going on here, we have to look down. We have to go deeper than the surface. Because if you could peel back that sand like a carpet, you would find a world that looks nothing like the one we see today. We already know that the sand is not as deep as it looks. In most places, it is only between 70 and 140 feet deep. If you're standing on top of a massive dune, you are actually standing on a very thin layer of dust compared to the rest of the planet. Underneath all that heat and grit is the bedrock. It is the ancient foundation of the African continent. And for a long time, researchers thought that was the end of the story. They figured it was just dry, cracked clay and old rock all the way down. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Let's talk about the biggest secret hiding under the Sahara. It is something more valuable than gold or oil. It is water. Millions of years ago, when the Earth was a very different place, huge amounts of water were trapped deep underground. This is what we call the Nubian sandstone aquifer system. It is the largest fossil water reserve in the entire world. We are talking about an underground ocean that stretches across 4 countries: Egypt, Libya, Chad, and Sudan. It covers an area of over 2 million square miles. That is about 2/3 the size of the contiguous United States. It is sitting right there, buried beneath the parched, burning desert. Think about how ironic that is. People and animals can wander for hundreds of miles on the surface and die of thirst, while a massive sea of fresh water is sitting just a few hundred feet beneath their boots. This water is called fossil water because it has been there for a very long time. Most of it was collected during the humid periods we talked about earlier. It is like a geological battery that took thousands of years to charge, and now it is just waiting there. But that is just the liquid part of the story. The really interesting stuff is what the water left behind before it went into the ground. Back in the 1980s, a space shuttle mission used a special kind of radar to look through the sand of the eastern Sahara. This was a game changer. The radar could see right through the dry dunes and reveal the landscape that existed millions of years ago. What they found was a network of ghost rivers. These are massive, dried-up riverbeds that are now completely buried. Some of these rivers were as wide as the Nile. They used to flow from the mountains in the south all the way to the Mediterranean. Scientists call these paleodrainage systems. They are the skeletal remains of Sahara that was once teeming with life. When they found these hidden riverbeds, it changed our understanding of the timeline. It meant that the desert was not just a static wasteland. It was a shifting, living thing. And hidden along these ancient riverbanks is where the real timeline breakers are found. Imagine you are an archaeologist digging in a place where nothing should be able to live. You are in a part of the desert that has not seen a drop of rain in 100 years. You start digging near one of these ghost rivers, and you find something. Not a rock, not a piece of wood, but an object that should not be there. This brings us to one of the most puzzling finds in the history of the Sahara. Deep in the heart of the desert, researchers found a collection of stone tools. Now, finding stone tools in the Sahara is common. People have lived there for thousands of years. But these tools were different. They were sophisticated. They were what we call Acheulean hand axes. These are teardrop-shaped stones that were flaked on both sides. They were the Swiss Army knives of the ancient world. But here's the catch. The layer of soil where these tools were found was much older than anyone expected. We are talking about a date that challenges the entire history of when humans left Africa. If these tools were found in a place that has been a desert for millions of years, how did they get there? And more importantly, who made them? Some of these finds suggest that ancient hominids were crossing the Sahara much earlier than we ever thought. It means the desert was not a barrier. It was a bridge. But it was a bridge that only appeared every few thousand years when the climate flipped. This is what we mean when we say an object is breaking the timeline. It forces us to rewrite the chapters of human history. It makes us realize that we are just scratching the surface of what our ancestors were capable of. But the sand hides more than just tools. It hides the Earth's own memory. Let us look at the eye of the Sahara again, but this time from the perspective of what lies beneath. Some geologists believe that the Rick-Hat structure is not just an eroded dome. They think it might be the top of a giant volcanic plug that never actually erupted. It is like a pimple on the Earth that stayed under the skin. The heat and pressure from deep within the planet pushed up the layers of rock, creating those perfect rings. And inside those rings, the sand acts like a time capsule. Because the wind moves the dunes around, it constantly reveals and then hides different parts of the structure. One day you might see a field of ancient fossils, and the next day they are gone. buried under 50 feet of sand. This constant movement is why the Sahara is so difficult to study. It is like trying to read a book while someone is constantly turning the pages and throwing dust in your eyes. But every once in a while, the wind blows just right and we get a glimpse of something truly bizarre. For example, in the middle of the desert in Egypt, there is a place called the Valley of the Whales. Its real name is Wadi al-Haytham. If you went there today, you would be surrounded by heat and sand. But if you look down, you will see the skeletons of whales. Hundreds of them. And these are not just any whales. They are Basilosaurus. These were ancient predators that had tiny little legs. Yes, you heard that right. Whales with legs. These fossils are about 40 million years old. They are the missing link that proves whales used to walk on land before they moved into the ocean. Finding them in the middle of a desert is the ultimate proof that the Sahara is a master disguise. It used to be the bottom of a shallow sea called the Tethys Ocean. When the tectonic plates shifted and the mountains rose, the sea receded and left these whales behind to be turned into stone. For millions of years, they were protected by the sand. Now, the wind is slowly uncovering them, one rib bone at a time. This tells us that the Sahara is not a place where life goes to die. It is a place where life is preserved. The lack of moisture and the constant covering of sand create the perfect conditions for a natural museum. We have found petrified forests with trees that are 65 feet tall. We have found the remains of giant crocodiles that would make a modern alligator look like a toy. We have even found the footprints of ancient humans walking along the shores of lakes that no longer exist. Every time we find one of these things, the timeline of our planet gets a little more complicated. We start to see that the Earth is not a stable place. It is a world of cycles. The Sahara has turned from green to yellow and back again over 230 times. Think about that number. 230 times the forest grew, the rivers flowed, and the animals moved in. And 230 times the sun got hotter. The rain stopped and the sand returned. Each cycle leaves a layer. Each layer holds a secret. And right now, we are living in the yellow phase. But the green phase is still down there, waiting. So, when we talk about the infinite horizon, we are talking about more than just distance. We are talking about time. The Sahara is a vertical mystery as much as a horizontal one. The object that started this whole story, that strange find that breaks the timeline, is just one piece of a giant puzzle. It is a reminder that we do not know nearly as much as we think we do. There are cities down there. There are forests down there. There are entire chapters of the human story that are currently covered by 100 feet of grit. But as our technology gets better, the desert is losing its ability to keep secrets. We are using satellites that can see through the ground. We are using drones that can map the dunes in 3 dimensions. And we are using DNA analysis to study mummies that have been sitting in the dark for 7,000 years. The infinite horizon is finally starting to shrink. We are beginning to see the edges of the truth. And the truth is that the Sahara is not a wasteland. It is a library. And we have only just begun to read the first page. Every discovery we make leads to another question. If there were people living in the green Sahara 50,000 years ago who had Neanderthal DNA but never left Africa, what does that say about our migration maps? If there are Roman cities like Timgad that stayed hidden for 1,000 years, what else is still out there? Could there be an even larger city? A lost capital of a desert empire that we have not even dreamed of? The possibility is what keeps explorers coming back. The heat is brutal and the wind is unforgiving, but the promise of what lies beneath is too strong to ignore. As we move forward, we have to realize that the Sahara is not a place we can conquer. It is a place we have to listen to. The stones, the ghost rivers, and the ancient tools are all trying to tell us something. They are telling us that the world is much older and much more complex than our history books say. They are telling us that the timeline we have built is just a rough draft. And the real version? Well, that is still buried under the sand, waiting for the wind to blow the right way. The desert is a patient teacher. It has been holding on to these secrets for millions of years. It can wait a little longer. But we are an impatient species. We want the answers now. We want to know exactly how that object got there and what it means for our future. Because if the Sahara has flipped 230 times before, it will flip again. The sand will disappear, the rain will return, and the ghost rivers will roar back to life. When that happens, the infinite horizon will be green once more. But until then, we will keep digging. We will keep searching. And we will keep wondering what other wonders are hiding just a few feet beneath our feet.